Hey guys, tonight we begin with something colder than your ex's heart and twice as unforgiving. Winter during the Great Depression. Not the vintage aesthetic Great Depression you see in sepia-toned photos. Not the noble suffering Great Depression romanticized in history books. I mean the real, actual bone-chilling, stomach-growling, hope-crushing winters of the 1930s, when the economy collapsed, the weather turned apocalyptic, and survival became a full-time job with absolutely no benefits. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, probably from a heated room with running water and a refrigerator full of food you're taking for granted. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. But first, let's pause and consider. Have you ever wondered what it was really like to survive a winter when banks failed, farms turned to dust, and the government's idea of help was a poster telling you to stay positive? What did people eat when the grocery stores were empty and money was worthless? How did families stay warm when they couldn't afford coal and the temperature dropped below zero? What do you do when the pipes freeze, the electricity's cut off, and your kids are asking why there's no Christmas this year? Could you survive 3 months of winter with no job, no savings, and neighbours just as desperate as you? Would you make it through a blizzard in a house with newspaper stuffed in the walls for insulation? And what happens when the snow finally melts and you realise spring isn't going to save you either? Congratulations, you've just woken up in January 1933, the coldest winter of the Great Depression. You have 14 cents to your name, a belly that hasn't been full in weeks, and a broken window covered with cardboard. The thermometer outside reads 8 degrees. Your breath makes clouds indoors. And you're one of the lucky ones because at least you still have a roof. Welcome to winter in the Great Depression, where survival isn't heroic. It's just exhausting. You open your eyes in the morning and the first thing you notice isn't the light or the time. It's the cold. Not, oh, it's chilly, cold. Not, I need an extra blanket cold. It's the kind of cold that makes your bones ache before you even move. The kind that turns your breath into fog inside your own bedroom. The Great Depression didn't just take people's jobs and savings, it took their heat. Coal was expensive, wood was scarce, and your drafty house built decades ago with gaps you could shove a cat through was basically a collaboration between you and winter to see who'd give up first. Your bedroom window, if it still has glass in it, is covered in a thick layer of ice. On the inside, that's not a design feature. That's condensation from your breath, freezing overnight on the glass. The walls are so thin you can hear your neighbour coughing 3 houses down, which would be concerning except you're too busy worrying about whether your own lungs are about to stage a protest. The floorboards are so cold that putting your feet on them feels like stepping onto a frozen lake. Some mornings there's actual frost on the floor, inside your house, where you sleep. Your blankets, and you're using that term generously, consist of whatever fabric you've managed to collect. Old coats, worn quilts, burlap sacks, maybe a wool blanket that's been in the family since before electricity was invented. You're sleeping under approximately 40 pounds of fabric, and you're still cold. You've been cold for so long that you've forgotten what warm feels like. It's like that sensation has been deleted from your memory, replaced entirely by various degrees of freezing. The house itself is an architectural disaster pretending to provide shelter. Most working-class homes in the 1930s were built before anyone had heard the phrase building codes, or insulation, or basic human comfort. The walls are single-layer wood planks with maybe some newspaper stuffed between the cracks if someone got ambitious. The roof leaks. The foundation has more holes than a conspiracy theory. And the windows, those wonderful portals to the outside world, fit so poorly in their frames that you can literally watch the curtains flutter from the wind coming through. Not outside, inside. Your curtains are waving at you from the indoor breeze. To modern people with their double-pane windows and central heating and thermostats they can control with their phones. This sounds like an exaggeration. It's not. This is just Tuesday in January 1933. You're essentially camping except the tent is made of wood, you can't leave, and there's a very real chance you might not wake up if the temperature drops low enough. Hypothermia doesn't just happen to mountain climbers and people who fall through ice. It happens to people sleeping in their own beds when the temperature inside their bedroom drops below freezing. Getting out of bed requires genuine courage. You have to leave your nest of inadequate blankets, expose yourself to air that's barely warmer than the outdoors, and force your stiff, aching body to function. Your joints crack like a frozen tree branch. Your muscles resist like they've been packed in ice overnight, which, spiritually speaking, they have. You sit up slowly, and your back immediately files a formal complaint. Welcome to mourning in the Great Depression. The house you're paying rent on, or more accurately failing to pay rent on, and praying you don't get evicted from, is actively trying to kill you. And the day has barely started. Getting dressed in the morning during the Great Depression wasn't about style or comfort. It was about survival, layering, and pretending that your coat wasn't held together by hope and a single button. You didn't have a winter wardrobe. You had one wool coat, 2 sweaters if you were lucky, and socks you'd darned so many times they were more thread than fabric. Everything you owned, you wore at once. It didn't matter if you looked like a lumpy scarecrow. Fashion was for people with money, and money was for people in fairy tales. Let's start with your underwear, if you even had any. Undergarments were considered optional luxuries during the Depression. If you owned a pair, you wore them until they literally fell apart, then you kept wearing them anyway. Holes weren't a reason to throw something away. Holes were just ventilation you didn't ask for. Women wore slips and combinations that had been mended so many times they looked like patchwork quilts. Men wore long johns that their grandfathers probably died in. Everything was grey, not by choice, but because that's what happens when you wash something 200 times in cold water with homemade lye soap. Your shirt, probably flannel or cotton if you were lucky, had been worn by at least 2 other family members before you. Hand-me-downs weren't a suggestion. They were the entire clothing economy. Shirt sleeves were too long or too short, never just right. Buttons were mismatched because original buttons were replaced with whatever could be scavenged from other clothing casualties. Some shirts had buttons made from carved wood, bent wire, or old coins with holes drilled through them. You looked like you'd been dressed by someone organising a very sad scavenger hunt. Then came the sweaters. Plural, if you could manage it. 1 wool sweater if you were a Rockefeller, 2 if you were prepared to look like a lumpy potato, 3 if hypothermia was a genuine concern, which it always was. These weren't the soft cashmere sweaters modern people impulse buy online. These were scratchy, hand-knitted wool sweaters that felt like wearing a Brillo pad. They smelled like wet sheep even when dry. They shed fibres constantly, but they were warm, or at least warmer than nothing, which was the standard you were working with. Your coat, that magnificent piece of outerwear doing the Lord's work, was probably older than you were. It had belonged to your father, or your uncle, or some distant relative who'd worn it during World War I. It was made of wool if you were fortunate, or some cotton blend monstrosity if you weren't. The lining, if it ever had one, was long gone. The pockets had holes, so anything you put in them eventually migrated to your socks. The buttons had mostly abandoned ship, replaced by safety pins, twine, or pure determination. You couldn't zip it closed because zippers were expensive, futuristic technology. You just wrapped it around yourself and hoped the wind didn't call your bluff. Socks were basically a joke. You darned them so many times that the original sock was just a suggestion. A vague memory underneath the layers of mismatched thread. Your heel poked through one hole, your big toe waved hello through another. Some people wore multiple pairs of socks, creating a lasagna of holes that somehow added up to partial foot coverage. Others wrapped their feet in newspaper or rags before putting on their disintegrating socks, creating a situation that was simultaneously warmer and more pathetic. And your shoes. Let's not even talk about your shoes. Actually, let's talk about them, because they deserve their own moment of horror. Most people during the Depression owned exactly 1 pair of shoes, and those shoes were held together by spite. The soles had holes, the leather was cracked, the laces had been broken and retied so many times they were more knot than lace. People stuffed cardboard inside their shoes to cover the holes, replacing it daily as it got wet and disintegrated. Some folks couldn't afford shoes at all, and wrapped their feet in burlap sacks tied with a rope. You got dressed in the morning looking like a refugee from a second-hand store fire. Nothing matched, nothing fit. Everything was patched, mended, safety-pinned, or held together by optimism. But at least you were dressed, and in the Great Depression, at least was the highest compliment anything could receive. Time for breakfast. Except there's no bacon sizzling, no eggs frying, no toast browning in a shiny toaster you don't own. Breakfast during the Great Depression was whatever you could scrape together from the back of the cupboard, and your rapidly diminishing sense of dignity. Maybe it's watered-down oatmeal. Maybe it's stale bread fried in lard. Maybe it's a single potato you're calling a meal while your stomach auditions for a horror movie. The term most important meal of the day hadn't been invented yet, which is good because this meal was more like a warning. Let's start with the oatmeal, if you're lucky enough to have any. And by oatmeal, I mean a handful of oats stretched into a full pot by adding approximately 9 gallons of water. The resulting mixture has the consistency of the wallpaper paste and the flavour of profound regret. You couldn't afford milk, so it's just water and oats, maybe with a pinch of salt if you're living large. Sugar. That's a fantasy reserved for birthday cakes in rich people's houses. You eat your grey slop from a chipped bowl, and you're grateful for it because at least it's hot and your stomach is too confused to complain immediately. If you don't have oatmeal, maybe you have bread. And by bread, I mean a rock-hard slice of yesterday's bread, or last week's bread, or bread that's been sitting on the counter so long it's achieved consciousness. You can't just bite into it because your teeth aren't that committed to the cause, so you fry it. In lard. Because butter costs money and lard costs significantly less money. You heat up a pan on your wood stove, assuming you can afford to light it, drop in a spoonful of lard that's been recycled from approximately 17 previous meals, and fry that bread until it's crispy enough to fool your mouth into thinking it's food. It tastes like poverty with a hint of whatever you cooked in that pan last Tuesday. Some families ate potato soup for breakfast, and by soup I mean a pot of hot water with potato slices floating in it like little life rafts of starch. No cream, no butter, no herbs or seasoning beyond salt if you had it. Just potatoes and water, served hot to create the illusion that this is an intentional meal, and not just ingredients that happen to be in the same pot. Your children stare at their bowls with the kind of disappointment usually reserved for cancelled Christmas. Coffee existed technically, but real coffee was expensive, so you drank coffee made from roasted barley, roasted chickpeas, or dandelion roots. It was brown. It was hot. It was absolutely not coffee, but you called it coffee anyway because admitting you were drinking hot grain water felt like surrendering to the universe. You sipped it slowly, partly to savour it, mostly because there wasn't going to be a second cup. If you were really desperate, breakfast was flour gravy. Just flour, water and lard mixed together into a paste, heated up and served over more bread. It was basically edible glue. It had no nutritional value beyond calories, which was all you were really asking for at this point. Your body wasn't craving vitamins or minerals, it was just screaming for literally anything to burn as fuel. Some mornings, breakfast was nothing. You just didn't eat. You told your kids the food was being saved for later, or that you'd already eaten, while your stomach growled loud enough to drown out the radio. You'd drink water to fill your belly and hope lunch would somehow materialize. It usually didn't, but hope was free. The truly tragic part wasn't just the terrible food. It was the memory of what breakfast used to be. Before the Depression, before the banks failed and the farms dried up, breakfast had been eggs and bacon and fresh bread and jam. Now it was survival paste served in embarrassed silence. You ate quickly, not because it was good, but because dwelling on it made everything worse. And as you scraped the last bit of grey slop from your bowl, your stomach sent you a message. Are you serious right now? Yes, stomach. Deadly serious. Now shut up. We've got a whole day of freezing and starving ahead of us. Keeping warm wasn't just difficult during Depression-era winters. It was a creative exercise in desperation. You couldn't afford coal, you couldn't afford gas. You definitely couldn't afford whatever newfangled electric heating rich people were using. So you improvised. You stuffed newspaper into the cracks in the walls. You hung blankets over doorways. You burned whatever you could find. Old furniture, corn cobs, dried manure if you lived on a farm. Your house became less of a home and more of a poorly insulated survival pod where everyone huddled around a tiny stove like cold, hungry penguins. Let's talk about that stove, the beating heart of your frozen household. If you were fortunate, you had a cast iron wood stove or a coal stove, ancient relics that heated approximately 3 square feet of space while the rest of your house remained at Arctic temperatures. The stove sat in the kitchen or the main room, and that's where your entire family lived. Not metaphorically, literally lived. You ate there, did homework there, and slept there because the bedrooms were essentially outdoor spaces that happened to have roofs. Fuel was the constant problem. Coal, the good stuff that actually produced heat, cost money nobody had. A ton of coal might cost $15, which sounds cheap until you remember that's 2 weeks' wages if you even had wages. So families bought coal by the bucket, rationing it like liquid gold, burning just enough to keep the stove barely warm. Some families sent their children to walk along railroad tracks, picking up chunks of coal that had fallen from freight cars. It wasn't stealing if it was already on the ground, right? That's what desperate parents told themselves while their kids scavenged like Victorian street urchins. If you couldn't afford coal or scavenge enough, you burned wood, but not nice. Split firewood from a proper woodpile. You burned whatever you could find. Old furniture got dismantled piece by piece. That wobbly chair, firewood. The broken dresser in the corner, firewood. The wooden fence in the backyard. Also firewood, though your neighbour might have opinions about that. Some families burned their own stairs, their own floorboards, their own door frames. They were literally burning their houses to heat their houses, which is the kind of irony that would be funny if it weren't so tragic. In rural areas, people burned corn cobs, dried grass, twisted hay, and yes, dried cow manure. Manure burns surprisingly well once it's dried out, though the smell is exactly what you'd expect. Your home smelled like a barn fire, but at least it was warm. Sort of, for a little while, until you needed to find more things to burn. The newspaper situation was its own form of insulation desperation. Families would take old newspapers and stuff them into every crack, gap and hole in the walls. The newspaper acted as a wind barrier, sort of, blocking some of the Arctic blast that came howling through. Some people actually papered their walls with newspaper, creating a sad, informative wallpaper that told you about news from 6 months ago while you slowly froze. It worked better than nothing, which was the Depression-era slogan for everything. Blankets and sheets were hung over doorways to create smaller heated zones. You couldn't heat the whole house, so you picked one room and tried to keep that room above freezing. Everyone crammed into that space. Privacy didn't exist. Personal space was a luxury. You sat shoulder to shoulder with your family. Sharing body heat like survival depended on it because it did. Windows were covered with anything that might provide insulation. Cardboard, old rugs, more newspaper, wooden boards. Some families lost their window glass to cracks from the cold and couldn't afford to replace it, so they just boarded up the windows entirely. Who needs natural light when you're fighting off hypothermia? The tragic reality was that none of it worked particularly well. You stuffed, hung, burned and improvised, and you were still cold. The wind still found ways inside. The temperature still dropped, but you kept trying because the alternative was giving up, and giving up meant dying. So you burned another chair leg, stuffed another newspaper into another crack and told yourself that spring was only 4 months away. Only 4 months. You could do this. Probably. Let's talk about the bathroom, or more accurately, the complete lack thereof. If you lived in a city tenement, you might share a single toilet with a dozen other families, and in winter, the pipes froze solid. If you lived in the country, congratulations, you had an outhouse. A wooden shack 50 feet from the house where the wind howled through the cracks, and the seat was cold enough to cause frostbite in places you'd rather not think about. Going to the bathroom in winter during the Great Depression wasn't just unpleasant, it was a test of courage, bladder control, and your willingness to risk hypothermia for basic human dignity. Let's start with the urban experience. You're living in a crowded tenement building, 3 or 4 families per floor, and there's exactly 1 bathroom per floor if you're lucky. Sometimes it's 1 bathroom for the entire building. This bathroom, and I'm using that term very generously, consists of a toilet that works occasionally, a sink with cold water only, and walls so thin you can hear every detail of your neighbour's digestive troubles. In winter, the pipes freeze, not sometimes, constantly. Water stops flowing, the toilet stops flushing. You're left with a room containing a porcelain monument to better times and a smell that would make a garbage truck gag. When the toilet doesn't work, people improvise. Chamber pots make a comeback. These delightful vessels, basically fancy buckets you use indoors and then have to empty outdoors, become standard equipment. You do your business in a pot in your freezing bedroom, then carry it down 3 flights of icy stairs at dawn to dump it in the alley behind the building. Nothing says dignity like walking through a tenement hallway at 6 in the morning, holding a bucket of your own waste while your neighbours pretend not to notice. But the real adventure was the outhouse. If you lived in a rural area or a small town, indoor plumbing was a fantasy reserved for rich people and presidential mansions. You had an outhouse, a small wooden structure in your backyard that served as your bathroom, meditation chamber, and occasionally your place to reconsider every life choice that led you to this moment. The outhouse itself was usually a wooden box with a bench and a hole, sometimes 2 holes if it was a fancy 2-seater model, where you could have existential conversations with family members while handling business. The walls were thin planks with gaps wide enough to let in wind, snow, and the judging eyes of passing neighbours. The door, if it had one, didn't lock properly and had a tendency to blow open at inopportune moments. In summer, outhouses were hot and smelly and filled with flies. In winter, they were frozen hellscapes. The temperature inside was roughly the same as outside, which in January 1933 could mean 10 degrees below zero. The wooden seat, worn smooth by generations of frozen posteriors, felt like sitting on a block of ice. Actually, it basically was a block of ice. Smart people kept old catalogues or newspaper inside for insulation purposes, placing a few sheets on the seat before committing. It helped approximately 0%, but it was something to do while you psyched yourself up. The journey to the outhouse required preparation. You couldn't just wander out in your nightclothes. You had to fully dress, coat, boots, hat, gloves if you owned them, because you were going outside into a blizzard to sit on frozen wood with your pants down. The walk from the house to the outhouse, usually about 50 feet, felt like a polar expedition. Snow drifts blocked the path. Ice made every step treacherous. The wind cut through your coat like you were wearing tissue paper. Once inside, speed was essential. You weren't there to read the news or contemplate philosophy. You handled your business as quickly as humanly possible, while trying not to think about the fact that your body parts were achieving temperatures previously only recorded in meat lockers. Toilet paper, if you had any, was rough newsprint or old catalogue pages. Most people used corn cobs, which is exactly as pleasant as it sounds. And then there was the smell, or rather, the lack thereof. It was so cold that even the smell froze, which sounds like a blessing until you realise that come spring, months of frozen waste would thaw all at once, creating an olfactory apocalypse. Night trips to the outhouse were particularly horrible. You had to navigate in the dark, possibly in a snowstorm, to a wooden box where anything could be waiting. Some people kept chamber pots indoors specifically to avoid midnight outhouse expeditions, which tells you everything about how much people hated that walk. Going to the bathroom in winter during the Great Depression wasn't a bodily function. It was an ordeal, a challenge, and occasionally a near-death experience. And you had to do it multiple times a day, every day. For months. If you were a kid during the Great Depression, winter wasn't about snowball fights and hot cocoa. It was about survival and labour. Many children didn't have proper winter coats. Some didn't have shoes at all, wrapping their feet in rags or newspapers and hoping for the best. School, if it was even open, was freezing. Teachers couldn't afford to heat the building. Kids sat in classrooms wearing their coats, mittens, and whatever scraps of wool their mothers could knit. And if your family needed you to work, collecting firewood, hauling water, scavenging coal along the railroad tracks, you didn't go to school at all. Childhood wasn't sacred. It was negotiable. Let's start with the shoes, or the heartbreaking lack thereof. In modern times, parents stress about buying their kids the right sneakers. In the 1930s, parents stressed about whether their kids would have any foot covering at all. Shoes were expensive. A decent pair of children's shoes could cost $2 or $3, which might as well have been $200 or $300. When you're choosing between shoes and food wins every time. So children went without. Some kids wrapped their feet in burlap sacks tied with string, creating makeshift boots that disintegrated in the snow within hours. Others stuffed their too small shoes with newspaper or cardboard, replacing the soggy padding daily as it got wet and fell apart. Walking to school in winter meant arriving with feet so numb you couldn't feel your toes, sitting in class while ice melted off your rags, and hoping you'd still have all 10 toes by spring. Frostbite among children was common, leaving permanent damage that followed them for life. The walk to school itself was brutal. Kids walked miles, sometimes 3 or 4 miles each way through snow, ice, and freezing wind. There were no school buses for most rural children, no parents driving them in heated cars. You walked, or you didn't go. Some children left for school before sunrise and arrived home after dark, spending their entire day in freezing conditions. They walked in groups when possible, sharing body heat and carrying younger siblings who couldn't make the journey alone. When they finally arrived at school, conditions weren't much better. Rural schoolhouses were one-room buildings heated by a single wood stove, if the school could afford fuel. Often they couldn't. Teachers, who were paid almost nothing and frequently went months without receiving their salaries, couldn't buy coal or wood on their own. So children sat in classrooms where they could see their breath, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, trying to write with fingers too cold to grip a pencil properly. Some schools simply closed during the worst winter months, not as a snow day treat, but because heating the building was impossible, and attendance had dropped to almost nothing. Education became a luxury that starving families couldn't afford. Children were needed at home, needed to work, needed to help the family survive. A 7-year-old who could collect coal along the railroad tracks was more valuable than a 7-year-old who could read. Child labour, which had been declining before the Depression, came roaring back. Children as young as 5 or 6 were put to work. They hauled water from frozen wells, breaking the ice with whatever tools they could find. They gathered firewood, dragging branches through the snow until their hands were raw. They scavenged dumps and alleys for anything useful, scraps of metal, old clothes, food that wasn't too spoiled. This wasn't character building. This was exploitation driven by desperation. In cities, children sold newspapers on frozen street corners, their voices hoarse from shouting headlines. They shined shoes for nickels, their own feet wrapped in rags. They begged, not because they were orphans from a Dickens novel, but because their parents had sent them out hoping strangers might take pity on a child when they wouldn't help an adult. Malnutrition was rampant among Depression-era children. They weren't getting enough calories, and what they did get lacked nutrition. Stunted growth, rickets, and other deficiency diseases were common. Children looked years younger than their actual age, their bodies failing to develop properly because they were essentially starving. Teachers reported students fainting from hunger in class, too proud or ashamed to admit they hadn't eaten in days. The psychological damage was just as severe. Children watched their parents struggle and fail. They heard their mothers cry at night. They saw their fathers break under the weight of unemployment and shame. They learned that the world was cruel, arbitrary, and unfair. They learned that hard work didn't guarantee success and that sometimes, no matter what you did, you still went hungry. Some children were sent away to live with relatives who had slightly more resources. Others were placed in orphanages when their parents simply couldn't feed them anymore. Families were torn apart not by malice but by mathematics. You couldn't divide nothing among 5 people. Something had to give. And yet, somehow, children found moments of joy. They played games that cost nothing. Kick the can, hide and seek, making snow angels in dirty snow. They told stories and sang songs. They took care of each other, older siblings raising younger ones with a competence that would seem impossible today. Childhood during the Great Depression wasn't stolen. It was compressed, hardened, forced to grow up faster than any child should have to. When those children grew up, they never forgot. They became the generation that saved everything, wasted nothing, and told their own children to finish their dinner because they remembered what it felt like to have none. If you lived in the Great Plains during the 1930s, you got to experience a special kind of nightmare. Winter plus the Dust Bowl. Imagine the wind howling across barren fields, whipping up frozen dirt and ice into a stinging, choking cloud. Snow didn't fall gently. It mixed with dust and created something meteorologists would later call a black blizzard. Your house, already half buried in dirt from summer storms, now had snowdrifts of frozen mud piling against the walls. You couldn't grow food. You couldn't leave. You were trapped in a frozen desert that used to be farmland, wondering if God had simply forgotten your zip code. The Dust Bowl wasn't just a summer problem. That's the part history books often skip. People imagine dust storms as hot, dry events happening under brutal sun. And yes, those happened. But winter dust storms were their own special brand of hell. The topsoil that had blown away during summer didn't disappear. It just waited. And when winter came with its freezing winds, that dust came back, mixed with ice and snow, creating storms that were somehow worse than either element alone. Picture this. You're standing in your yard in January, and the sky turns black. Not dark grey like a normal storm. Black. Like someone draped a curtain over the sun. The wind picks up and suddenly you're being pelted with what feels like frozen sandpaper. It's not snow. It's not hail. It's dirt particles mixed with ice crystals travelling at 40 miles per hour, hitting your face like tiny frozen bullets. You can't breathe without choking. You can't see more than a few feet. You stumble toward your house, praying you're going in the right direction, because getting lost in your own backyard during a black blizzard was a real way to die. Inside your house, which is supposed to be your shelter, dust seeped through every crack, every gap, every microscopic opening. You'd stuff rags under doors, tape newspaper over windows, hang wet sheets over vents, and the dust still got in. It covered your furniture, your food, your bed. You'd wake up with a layer of grit on your face. You'd eat meals with a towel over your plate, lifting it only long enough to take a bite, and you'd still crunch dirt between your teeth. The snow, when it came, didn't bring relief. It brought mud. Frozen, airborne mud that stuck to everything. Snowdrifts weren't white and picturesque. They were brown, grey, and black, piled against houses and barns like frozen sewage. When they melted, they didn't leave clean water. They left thick, contaminated sludge that destroyed what little vegetation had survived the drought. Farmers watched their land die in slow motion. The topsoil, the good earth that their grandparents had ploughed, was gone, blown away, replaced by hardpan and dust. They couldn't plant winter wheat because the ground was too damaged. Even if they could plant, nothing would grow. The land had been farmed too aggressively for too long, and now it was retaliating. What had once been prairie grassland, held together by deep roots over thousands of years, was now just loose dirt waiting for the next wind. Livestock suffered horribly. Cattle and horses stood in fields with no grass, no shelter, exposed to freezing winds full of stinging dust. They developed dust pneumonia, a condition where fine particles lodged in their lungs, slowly suffocating them. Farmers had to shoot animals they couldn't feed, couldn't save, and couldn't afford to keep. The carcasses lay frozen in the fields, covered in layers of dirty snow, waiting for spring that wouldn't bring any solutions. Children developed something doctors called dust pneumonia too. It wasn't actual pneumonia, but a respiratory condition caused by inhaling too much dust over too long a period. Kids coughed constantly, their lungs trying desperately to expel dirt that had settled deep in the tissue. Some died from it. Others lived with damaged lungs for the rest of their lives. Mothers tied wet cloths over their children's faces during storms, creating makeshift masks that helped minimally and looked like something from a plague ward. The psychological toll was immense. Farmers had built their entire identities around working the land, coaxing life from soil, providing for their families. Now the land was dead, the crops were gone, and they were helpless. They'd done everything right according to generations of farming wisdom, and it hadn't mattered. Nature, combined with economic collapse, had beaten them. Some families gave up and left, joining the mass migration westward toward California, where rumours promised work and food. They abandoned their farms, their homes, everything they'd built, and headed west in overloaded trucks and cars. Those who stayed did so either because they couldn't afford to leave or because they were too stubborn to admit defeat. They hunkered down in their dirt-filled houses, rationed their dwindling supplies, and waited for winter to end. But winter didn't bring the promise of spring. It brought the certainty that next summer would bring more dust, more drought, more failure. The Dust Bowl wasn't a single disaster. It was a rolling catastrophe that lasted years, and winter just added frozen misery to the existing collection of horrors. This was biblical punishment without the biblical crime. Farmers hadn't angered God. They'd just farmed too much, ploughed too deep, removed too many native grasses, and now, in the frozen hell of a Dust Bowl winter, they were paying for it with interest. When you couldn't feed yourself or your family, you swallowed your pride and joined the breadline. These lines stretched for blocks, filled with men in threadbare coats, women clutching children, everyone waiting hours in the freezing cold for a loaf of bread or a bowl of watery soup. The soup kitchens, run by charities and churches, served tens of thousands of people daily. The soup itself was barely food, hot water with maybe some vegetables and, if you were lucky, a scrap of meat. But it was warm, it filled your stomach, and sometimes that thin, tasteless broth was the only thing standing between you and starvation. The bread lines appeared in every major American city by 1930, and they grew longer every year. In New York City, some lines wrapped around entire city blocks, thousands of people standing shoulder to shoulder in the cold, waiting for food they hadn't paid for and desperately hoped no one they knew would see them accepting. Men who'd been bankers, accountants, and shop owners now stood in line with their hats pulled low, trying to hide their faces. The shame was crushing. In America, you were supposed to provide for yourself. Accepting charity meant admitting failure, and for many people, especially men who'd been raised to be providers, that failure felt like death. The wait could take hours, 3, 4, sometimes 5 hours standing in the cold while the line inched forward at a pace that made glaciers look speedy. Your feet went numb, your hands turned blue, your stomach cramped from emptiness and anticipation. Around you, people stamped their feet and blew into their hands, creating small clouds of breath that dissipated into the frozen air. Some people fainted from hunger or cold and were carried out of line, their spot immediately taken by someone else. The line never shrank. It only grew. When you finally reached the front, you were handed a loaf of bread, usually day-old or older, donated by bakeries looking to offload their unsold stock. Sometimes you got a bowl of soup ladled from enormous vats by volunteers who tried to smile but mostly just looked tired. The soup was thin, almost translucent, with a few chunks of potato or turnip floating like lonely islands in a beige ocean. Meat, when it appeared, was more rumour than substance. Tiny shreds that might have once been part of a chicken or cow, but had been boiled into anonymous protein. The soup kitchens themselves were usually set up in church basements, community centres, or abandoned storefronts. The most famous was run by Al Capone in Chicago, which tells you something about how bad things had gotten when a notorious gangster was more helpful than the government. Capone's kitchen served 3 meals a day to thousands of people, no questions asked. It was excellent publicity for a mobster, sure, but it also kept people alive, which was more than most institutions were managing. Inside these kitchens, long tables were set up where people ate standing up or sitting on whatever makeshift seating existed. There was no ambience, no dignity, no pretense. You shuffled in, got your food, ate it quickly, and left to make room for the next wave of hungry people. The smell was a mix of boiled vegetables, unwashed bodies, and institutional cleaning products. Not pleasant, but at least it was warm inside, and for some people, the soup kitchen was the only heated building they'd enter all week. Volunteers who ran these kitchens were overwhelmed. They'd signed up thinking they'd help a few dozen people, and found themselves serving thousands. They worked 12-hour shifts, stirring massive pots, slicing donated bread, trying to make inadequate supplies stretch to feed everyone who showed up. They watered down the soup as the day went on, adding more liquid to serve more people, until by evening the soup was basically flavoured hot water with a vague memory of vegetables. Children were priority in most soup kitchens. If supplies were running low, volunteers made sure kids ate first. Mothers would take their portion and split it among their children, insisting they'd already eaten while their hollow cheeks told a different story. Volunteers noticed. They tried to sneak extra food to mothers when they could, but there was never enough. There was never, ever enough. Some people came to the same soup kitchen every day, becoming familiar faces to volunteers. Others rotated between different kitchens, too ashamed to be recognised as regulars. Men often came alone, having sent their families to different locations to maximise the household's food intake. They'd meet up afterward, combining their loaves of bread and comparing soup quality like they were reviewing restaurants instead of trying to survive. The bread lines and soup kitchens saved lives. That's not an exaggeration. Without them, the death toll from starvation during the Depression would have been catastrophic. But they couldn't feed everyone. Rural areas had fewer resources. Small towns had nothing. Families too proud to ask for help starved quietly in their homes. The soup kitchens caught thousands, but thousands more slipped through the gaps. And here's the thing that made it all worse. The food being served in soup kitchens was often surplus from farmers who couldn't sell their crops. While people starved in cities, farms were destroying food they couldn't afford to harvest or transport. Milk was poured into ditches, crops were ploughed under, livestock was slaughtered and buried. The problem wasn't lack of food. It was lack of money, lack of distribution, and an economic system that had collapsed so completely that food and hungry people couldn't find each other. Standing in that bread line, holding your thin soup, you weren't just hungry. You were angry, confused. Wondering how the richest country in the world had managed to fail so completely that charity soup was the only thing keeping millions of its citizens alive. Finding work during the Great Depression was like searching for a unicorn. Everyone had heard it existed, but no one had actually seen it. Unemployment hit 25%. Factories closed. Farms failed. Banks collapsed. Men who'd worked their whole lives suddenly found themselves unemployed, standing on street corners selling apples for a nickel or offering to shovel snow for pennies. Winter made it worse. Construction stopped. Outdoor labour disappeared. You couldn't even beg effectively because everyone else was just as broke as you. Work wasn't just scarce, it was practically mythical. Let's put that 25% unemployment rate in perspective. That's 1 in 4 working-age adults without a job. In reality, it was worse because that number didn't count people who'd given up looking, people working part-time who needed full-time work, or the millions of women whose unemployment wasn't officially tracked because society pretended women didn't need jobs. The actual number of people unable to support themselves was closer to 40% or 50%. Half the country was economically drowning. For men, especially men who'd defined themselves by their work, unemployment was a psychological catastrophe. You'd been a steelworker, a banker, a shop owner. You'd provided for your family. You'd had dignity, purpose, routine. Now you had nothing. You woke up with nowhere to go. You couldn't tell your children why there was no food. You watched your wife's disappointment slowly harden into resentment or worse, pity. The shame was suffocating. So you did what desperate people do. You tried everything. You stood on the street corners holding signs offering to work for food. You went door to door asking if anyone needed odd jobs done. You walked to factories and waited outside the gates along with hundreds of other men, hoping the foreman might need one extra worker that day. He never did. But you came back the next day anyway, because what else were you going to do? The apple-selling phenomenon became a symbol of Depression-era desperation. In 1930, the International Apple Shippers Association had a surplus of apples and came up with a brilliant idea. Sell them on credit to unemployed men who could then resell them on street corners for a nickel each. It was marketed as entrepreneurship. It was actually desperation with better branding. Men stood on freezing corners, apples arranged on wooden crates shouting, "Apples! 5 cents!" to passers-by who were also broke. You were competing with hundreds of other apple sellers in the same city, all of you trying to sell the same product to people who couldn't afford food. If you sold all your apples, you might make $1.50. If. Some men took whatever degrading work they could find. They shined shoes, a job previously done by children. They became door-to-door salesmen, hawking everything from brushes to magazine subscriptions to people who'd slam doors in their faces. They shoveled snow for pennies, their backs breaking for coins that barely bought bread. They collected scrap metal, rags and bottles, pushing carts through alleys like urban prospectors searching for treasure in trash. Winter made everything worse because seasonal work disappeared. Construction, the traditional backup employment for desperate men, stopped completely. You can't pour concrete when it's below freezing. You can't do road work in a blizzard. All those jobs that kept men employed during economic downturns simply evaporated from November through March. You were left with nothing but time and hunger. Day labour markets emerged in cities, places where men gathered at dawn hoping to be selected for a few hours of work. Potential employers would drive up, survey the crowd like they were shopping for livestock, and point to the strongest-looking men. You, and you. 1 day's work, $2. The chosen few climbed into trucks while everyone else shuffled home defeated, and those $2? They'd go straight to food, rent, or debt, gone before the day ended. Scams and exploitation thrived. Fake job postings lured desperate people into paying application fees for jobs that didn't exist. Employers hired workers for a week and then fired them before payday, bringing in a new batch of desperate men to exploit. Some businesses put out help-wanted signs just to watch crowds of applicants fight for jobs they never intended to fill. It was psychological warfare disguised as economic necessity. Women faced their own employment hell. The few jobs available to women, domestic work, sewing, laundry, paid even less than men's work. But at least they existed. Ironically, women's work was more stable during the Depression, because wealthy families still needed maids and cooks, even if they paid them almost nothing. Women worked 12-hour days scrubbing other people's floors, washing other people's clothes, and raising other people's children while their own families went hungry. They were paid $3 or $4 a week, an insult disguised as wages. For married women, finding work was even harder because society believed they were stealing jobs from men who needed to support families. Many employers openly refused to hire married women. Some states passed laws prohibiting it. The fact that those women also needed to support families somehow didn't factor into this logic. Young people entering the workforce faced a cruel reality. There was no workforce to enter. High school graduates found themselves competing with experienced workers for non-existent jobs. Some rode the rails, hopping freight trains to search for work in other cities, finding the same unemployment everywhere. Others just gave up, joining the ranks of what would later be called a lost generation. People whose careers never started, whose potential was wasted, whose youth was spent waiting for an economy that wouldn't recover for a decade. The cruelest part wasn't just the lack of work, it was the way unemployment destroyed identity. When someone asked, "What do?" you had no answer. You weren't anything. You were just someone waiting, hoping, slowly starving, and trying not to notice how much your family was suffering because of your inability to find something that didn't exist. When people lost their homes, they didn't just disappear. They built new ones out of scrap metal, cardboard, tar paper, and sheer desperation. These shanty towns, bitterly nicknamed Hoovervilles after President Herbert Hoover, sprang up in every major city. In winter, they became frozen hellscapes. No insulation, no heat. Families huddled together under thin blankets, burning whatever trash they could find to stay warm. Children got frostbite, adults got pneumonia. And everyone wondered how the richest country in the world had let its people freeze in cardboard boxes. Hoovervilles appeared wherever there was unused land. City parks, riverbeds, empty lots, under bridges, along railroad tracks. At their peak, there were hundreds of these settlements across America. Seattle had one with over 1,000 residents. New York's Central Park had several. St. Louis had the largest, with an estimated 1,500 people living in makeshift shacks. These weren't temporary camping spots. They were permanent communities where people lived for months or years. Because losing your home during the Depression wasn't a brief setback. It was often permanent. The homes in Hoovervilles were architectural nightmares held together by prayer and rusty nails. People built them from whatever they could scavenge. Flattened tin cans, wooden crates, cardboard boxes from appliance deliveries, tar paper, old blankets, and scraps of sheet metal. The structures were usually one room, barely tall enough to stand in, with no windows and a piece of cloth or burlap serving as a door. Some were elaborate by Hooverville standards, featuring actual wooden frames and multiple rooms divided by hanging sheets. Others were literally cardboard boxes turned on their sides with a person curled inside. In summer, these shacks were ovens. In winter, they were refrigerators. There was no insulation. The walls, made of single layers of cardboard or thin metal, provided zero protection against the cold. Wind blew through gaps and cracks. Rain and snow leaked through holes in the roof. The floor, usually bare dirt, turned to frozen mud in winter. Families would stuff newspapers and rags into cracks, just like in their old real houses, and it worked just as poorly. Heating was nearly impossible and incredibly dangerous. Some residents built small fire pits inside their shacks, burning whatever they could find: trash, scrap wood, old newspapers. This created two problems. First, the smoke had nowhere to go, so everyone inside was constantly choking and coughing. Second, the fire hazard was enormous. A single spark could ignite the whole shack, and once fire started in a Hooverville, it spread like a horror movie. Entire sections would burn down in minutes, residents fleeing with whatever they could grab, which was usually nothing because they already had nothing. Most people couldn't risk fires inside their shacks, so they built communal fire pits outside where residents gathered for warmth. Picture dozens of people standing around a burning barrel in January, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, trying to get warm on one side while the other side of their body froze. It was like rotisserie survival. You'd warm your front, then turn and warm your back, constantly rotating, never actually getting warm, just temporarily less frozen. Sanitation in Hoovervilles was a disaster. There were no toilets, no running water, no sewage systems. People dug pit latrines or just used designated areas at the edge of the settlement. In winter, these froze solid, which sounds like it might be less smelly but actually created worse problems. Waste accumulated, disease spread, and when spring came, the thaw created a health crisis that would make a medieval plague town proud. Water had to be carried from wherever it could be found. Public pumps, rivers, sympathetic neighbours. In winter, this meant breaking ice and carrying frozen buckets back to your shack. Drinking water, washing water, cooking water, every drop had to be transported. There were no baths, no showers, no way to stay clean. Everyone in a Hooverville smelled like smoke, sweat, and despair. The residents were diverse. Unemployed factory workers, evicted tenants, foreclosed farmers, entire families with children. They weren't society's outcasts before the Depression. They were ordinary people who'd lost everything. Some men left their families in Hoovervilles while they searched for work, promising to send money that never came. Some families stayed together, crowding into tiny shacks where privacy was impossible and dignity was a distant memory. Communities formed despite the conditions. People helped each other, shared food when they had it, watched each other's children. Some Hoovervilles elected mayors and established rules. They created makeshift schools for children. They organised communal kitchens. Humans being humans, they built society even in a cardboard box slum. But don't romanticize it. Life in a Hooverville was brutal, dehumanizing, and deadly. Children developed respiratory diseases from smoke and cold. Adults suffered from malnutrition and exposure. The elderly often didn't survive their first winter. People died quietly in their shacks and weren't discovered for days. The bitter irony of the name Hooverville wasn't lost on residents. President Hoover had promised prosperity. He'd said the Depression would pass quickly. He'd insisted that private charity and local government could handle the crisis. Meanwhile, thousands of Americans were freezing in shacks made of garbage, naming their misery after him like a curse. Police occasionally raided Hoovervilles, bulldozing shacks and arresting residents for trespassing or vagrancy. The residents would scatter, then return days later and rebuild in the same spot or move to a new vacant lot. You couldn't arrest your way out of a housing crisis caused by economic collapse, but cities tried anyway because seeing Hoovervilles was embarrassing. It contradicted the American myth of prosperity and progress. The Hoovervilles lasted until World War II, when the economy finally recovered and people could afford real housing again. But the shame of them, the fact that America allowed its citizens to live like that, haunted the nation for generations. Getting sick during a Great Depression winter wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially fatal. Frostbite turned fingers and toes black. Pneumonia killed thousands. Tuberculosis spread through crowded tenements like wildfire, and if you needed a doctor, good luck. Most people couldn't afford one. Even if you could, medicine was expensive and hospitals were for the wealthy. Folk remedies and prayer were your healthcare plan. You wrapped frostbitten limbs in warm rags, drank questionable herbal teas, and hoped your body was stronger than the cold. Many times, it wasn't. Let's start with frostbite, the winter injury that turned extremities into casualties of war. When you spent hours outside in sub-zero temperatures with inadequate clothing, frostbite wasn't a possibility, it was inevitable. Your fingers went numb first, then white, then waxy looking. If you caught it early and warmed up slowly, you might be fine. But most people didn't catch it early because they couldn't afford to stop working, stop walking, or stop doing whatever desperate activity was keeping them alive. Advanced frostbite turned tissue black as the cells died. Fingers, toes, ears, noses, any body part exposed to extreme cold for too long would necrotize. Without proper medical treatment, which meant without any medical treatment at all for most people, gangrene could set in. The only solution then was amputation, and if you couldn't afford a doctor, that meant your neighbour doing it in your kitchen with a saw and some whiskey for anaesthesia. People lost fingers, toes, even entire feet to frostbite during Depression winters. And losing digits wasn't just painful and traumatic, it made it even harder to find work afterward. Hard to be a labourer when you're missing half your fingers. Pneumonia was the real killer. The combination of malnutrition, exposure to cold, and crowded living conditions created a perfect storm for respiratory infections. Your immune system, already weakened from not eating enough, couldn't fight off bacteria that invaded your lungs. Pneumonia would start as a cough, progress to fever and chest pain, and then you'd be bedridden, struggling to breathe while your family watched helplessly. The treatment for pneumonia in the 1930s was rest, fluids, and prayer. Penicillin wouldn't become widely available until the 1940s. Before antibiotics, pneumonia had a mortality rate of around 30%. That means 1 in 3 people who got it died. Those odds were even worse for children, the elderly, and people who were already malnourished, which described most of Depression-era America. You'd lie in bed, fever burning, lungs filling with fluid, and hope that your body figured it out before you drowned in your own mucus. Tuberculosis, the White Plague, thrived in crowded tenements where families lived packed together in poorly ventilated rooms. TB spread through the air when infected people coughed. When you're living 10 people to a 2-room apartment, everyone breathing the same stale air, one case of TB could infect the entire household. The disease caused chronic coughing, weight loss, night sweats, and eventually death. The only treatment was rest and fresh air, preferably in a sanatorium, but sanatoriums cost money, so people with TB just stayed home, coughing, infecting others, and slowly dying. Medical care was a luxury so far beyond most people's reach, it might as well have been on another planet. A doctor's house call could cost $2 or $3, which was a week's worth of food. Medicine was extra. If you needed hospitalization, that could run $10 or $20 a day, an impossible sum for families who were counting pennies. So people just didn't go to doctors, they suffered at home, treating themselves with whatever folk remedies their grandmothers had sworn by. Home remedies range from harmless to horrifying. For colds and flu, people made onion poultices, garlic tea, and mustard plasters. Some of these might have helped a little through this placebo effect or by providing warmth. Others, like kerosene mixed with sugar, yes, people gave this to children, were actively dangerous. Desperate parents tried anything that someone claimed had worked once for someone's cousin's neighbour. For frostbite, the common treatment was rubbing snow on the affected area, which is exactly the wrong thing to do and can cause more tissue damage. But medical knowledge among the general population was spotty, and folk wisdom filled the gaps. People wrapped frostbitten limbs in warm cloths, which was correct, but they also tried turpentine, lard, and other substances that did nothing or made it worse. Broken bones were set at home by whoever in the family had the strongest stomach. Dislocations were popped back into place by neighbours who'd done it before. Deep cuts were stitched with regular sewing needles and thread. Infections were treated by applying bread mould or spider webs, which occasionally worked through sheer luck since mould contains penicillin, but usually just made things worse. Childbirth was particularly dangerous. Most women gave birth at home, attended by midwives or female relatives, because hospitals were unaffordable. Without proper sanitation, without antibiotics, without emergency surgical options, maternal mortality was significant. If something went wrong during delivery, hemorrhaging, infection, breech position, the mother often died. The baby frequently died too. Families grieved, buried their dead quickly, and tried not to think about how $100 in a hospital might have changed everything. The psychological impact of untreated illness was crushing. When your child was sick and you couldn't afford a doctor, you felt like a failure. When your husband developed pneumonia and you could only offer warm tea and hope, the helplessness was unbearable. When your own body was breaking down from malnutrition and cold, and you knew there was no help coming, despair set in deeper than any infection. Some communities had charity clinics where doctors volunteered their time, treating patients for free or for whatever they could pay. A chicken, a dozen eggs, a promise to pay someday. These clinics were overwhelmed, operating out of church basements or settlement houses with lines as long as the bread lines. The doctors did their best, but they were treating symptoms of poverty, malnutrition and exposure, conditions that required economic solutions, not medical ones. The cruelest irony was that many deaths during the Depression were completely preventable with basic medical care that existed, but was simply unavailable to poor people. The medicine was there, the knowledge was there, the resources existed, but if you couldn't pay, you couldn't access them. So people died of treatable conditions while watching their loved ones suffer, knowing that somewhere, someone who could afford it was getting exactly the help they needed. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs eventually brought some relief, but in those early winters, help was slow, bureaucratic and insufficient. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work planting trees and building parks, but it didn't feed their families back home. The Works Progress Administration created jobs, but not nearly enough. Aid programs handed out food and coal, but the lines were long and the supplies limited. For many Americans, government help felt like a band-aid on a bullet wound. Better than nothing, but not enough to stop the bleeding. Before Roosevelt took office in March 1933, the federal government's response to the Depression was essentially thoughts and prayers. President Hoover believed in rugged individualism and insisted that private charity and local governments should handle the crisis. This worked about as well as fighting a forest fire with a water pistol. By the time FDR was inaugurated, the country was in freefall, banks were collapsing, unemployment was at 25%, and people were starving in the streets. The incoming administration faced a disaster so enormous that any response was going to look inadequate. The Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, was one of the New Deal's earliest programs, launched in 1933. It hired young men aged 18 to 25 to work on environmental projects, planting trees, building trails, constructing fire towers, developing parks. The work was legitimate, and the program eventually employed over 3 million men during its existence. They lived in camps, received food, shelter and clothing, and were paid $30 a month, 25 of which was sent directly home to their families. On paper, it sounds great. In practice, it had problems. First, it only hired young single men. If you were over 25, married, or had kids depending on you, tough luck. The program was designed to get unemployed youth off the streets, not to support families. So while your teenage son might be living well in a CCC camp, earning money planting trees in Montana, you were still at home with no job, no income, and 5 other mouths to feed. That $25 he sent home helped, sure, but it wasn't enough to support an entire household. The Works Progress Administration, or WPA, was more ambitious. Launched in 1935, it aimed to create jobs for millions of unemployed Americans, building infrastructure, schools, roads, bridges, and public buildings. It also employed artists, writers, and musicians, which was radical and controversial. The WPA eventually employed about 8.5 million people over its lifetime, which sounds impressive until you remember that there were over 12 million people unemployed when it started. It helped millions, yes, but it left millions more without assistance. The jobs paid wages, but they were limited. WPA work was intentionally kept below private sector rates to avoid competing with regular employment, which made sense economically, but meant that WPA workers were still struggling financially. You might have a job building a road, but you were earning barely enough to feed your family, and the work was often temporary, ending when the project finished. Then you were unemployed again, waiting for the next project, hoping your name got called. The bureaucracy was maddening. To get WPA work, you had to prove you were destitute, which required paperwork, interviews, and verification. You had to register, wait for your name to come up and hope that a project existed in your area. In rural regions, WPA projects were scarce. In cities, the waiting lists were enormous. People spent months waiting for jobs that might last only a few weeks. Food relief programs distributed surplus commodities to hungry families: flour, cornmeal, canned goods, dried beans. This helped significantly, but the distribution was chaotic and inconsistent. Some counties had well-organized programs, others had almost nothing. The food itself was basic, monotonous, and often insufficient for a family's needs. You'd get your monthly allotment of flour and beans and wonder how you were supposed to make that stretch for 4 weeks. Coal programs provided fuel for heating, distributing coal to families who couldn't afford it. Again, this was helpful but limited. The coal came in small quantities, rationed carefully, never quite enough to keep a house warm all winter. You'd burn through your government coal in 2 weeks, and then you were back to scavenging or burning furniture. The Social Security Act of 1935 created a safety net for the elderly and unemployed, but its benefits wouldn't kick in for years. If you were old and starving in 1935, Social Security wasn't going to help you. The first benefits weren't paid until 1940. It was planning for the future while people were dying in the present. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA, provided direct cash relief to states, which then distributed it to families. This was probably the most directly helpful program, but it was also controversial because many people considered cash relief to be charity that destroyed dignity and created dependency. As if starving with your dignity intact was somehow noble. FERA provided just enough money to keep people from dying immediately, but not enough to lift them out of poverty. It was subsistence, not salvation. And then there was the political opposition. Every New Deal program faced fierce criticism from conservatives who believed the government was overstepping, creating socialism, destroying American individualism. The Supreme Court struck down several programs as unconstitutional. Congress fought over funding. Meanwhile, people were starving, freezing and dying while politicians debated economic theory. The fundamental problem was scale. The Depression was so massive, so widespread, and so deeply rooted in structural economic failure that no government program could fix it quickly. The New Deal helped millions of people. It prevented complete societal collapse. It gave hope when hope was scarce. But it didn't end the Depression. That wouldn't happen until World War II ramped up industrial production and created full employment. So if you were living through a Depression winter, waiting for government help, it felt like this. You're drowning in the ocean. Someone throws you a rope. It's too short to reach the boat. They tell you to be patient. They're working on making it longer. Meanwhile, you're still drowning. Just drowning with the knowledge that help exists somewhere. It's just not enough, and it's not here yet. Better than nothing? Absolutely. Enough? Not even close. When money ran out and the cupboards were bare, people got creative. Creative is a polite way of saying horrifying. Families made water soup. Hot water with salt and maybe an onion if they were lucky. They ate dandelion greens, wild berries and whatever they could forage. Flour sacks were rinsed and turned into clothing because even the fabric was valuable. Lard sandwiches, ketchup, soup and fried dough became staples. Some families caught sparrows and pigeons. Others stole food from garbage cans behind restaurants. Hunger didn't just make people desperate. It made them inventive in ways no one should have to be. Let's start with the recipes that haunt anyone who researches Depression-era cuisine. Water soup was exactly what it sounds like. Boiling water with salt and, if you were having a good day, an onion or potato thrown in. Sometimes people added ketchup to give it colour and pretend it was tomato soup. It wasn't. It was hot, slightly flavoured water that filled your stomach temporarily and provided approximately 0 nutritional value. Mothers served it to their children while calling it special soup, and hoping the kids were too young to realise they were essentially eating poverty-flavoured broth. Dandelion salad became a staple because dandelions were free and grew everywhere. People picked them from yards, parks and roadsides, boiled the greens to remove bitterness, and ate them with whatever dressing they could make from vinegar and leftover bacon grease. It tasted bitter, stringy and depressing. But it was food, technically, and it didn't cost anything. Some families also ate wild onions, pokeweed and lamb's quarters, foraging like medieval peasants in a country that was supposed to be modern and prosperous. Fried dough, made from flour, water, and a pinch of salt, became a meal when there was nothing else. You'd mix up a thick batter, fry it in whatever fat you had, and eat it plain. No sugar, no jam, just fried carbohydrates that sat in your stomach like a lead weight. Children called it depression pancakes, or poor man's donuts, names that tried to make desperation sound whimsical. It didn't work. It just tasted like giving up. The lard sandwich deserves special mention because it perfectly encapsulates depression eating. 2 slices of bread with a smear of lard in between. That's it. Sometimes people sprinkled salt and pepper on the lard to create the illusion of flavour. Lard was cheap, calorie-dense, and available when everything else ran out. It tasted like eating a candle, but candles don't keep you alive. Lard sandwiches somehow did. Ketchup soup was another masterpiece of desperation cooking. You'd take ketchup, usually acquired from a charity or relief program, mix it with hot water and call it tomato soup. Some families added crackers if they had them. The result was a thin, sweetish, vaguely tomato-flavoured liquid that was mostly water and regret. But it was warm. It was red like real food, and it tricked your brain for about 5 minutes into thinking you'd eaten something substantial. Milk toast sounds almost quaint until you realise it was a meal, not a snack. You'd take stale bread, toast it if you could afford to light the stove, put it in a bowl and pour hot milk over it. If you didn't have milk, you used hot water. If you didn't have bread, you just drank the hot water and cried. Milk toast was given to children, the elderly, and sick people, because it was soft and easy to digest. It was also depressing as hell. Wild game became food for people who'd never hunted before. Families trapped squirrels, rabbits, and raccoons. They caught pigeons and sparrows using homemade traps or rocks. City kids became surprisingly good at hunting urban birds, bringing home strings of sparrows like tiny tragic trophies. The meat was gamey, tough, and required serious cooking to be remotely palatable. But protein was protein, and people learned to make squirrel stew, rabbit pie, and pigeon pot pie using recipes their great-grandmothers might have used during the Civil War. Foraging extended to unconventional sources. People raided garbage cans behind restaurants and grocery stores, competing with actual rats for discarded food that was spoiled but not quite rotten. Bakeries threw out day-old bread, and people fought over it. Butchers discarded bones with scraps of meat still attached, and families boiled them for broth. Dumpster diving wasn't a lifestyle choice, it was survival. Some families practiced what would now be called extreme food preservation. Potato peels were fried and eaten. Apple cores were cooked into mush. Chicken bones were boiled multiple times until they dissolved into calcium-rich paste. Nothing was wasted. Ever. The concept of throwing away food became morally unthinkable. Wild plants that previous generations had forgotten about made a comeback. People remembered or learned which weeds were edible: purslane, chickweed, wood sorrel, plantain. Older folks taught younger ones how to identify safe plants, and suddenly everyone became amateur foragers. Some people got it wrong and ate plants that made them sick, but when you're starving, even a 10% chance of getting poisoned seems worth the risk for calories. In rural areas, people milked their neighbours' cows without permission, stole chickens and borrowed vegetables from gardens. It wasn't quite stealing because everyone understood the alternative was starvation, but it created tensions. Some farmers set traps or stayed up nights guarding their crops from hungry neighbours. Others looked the other way, remembering that they might be desperate next month. The most heartbreaking stories involved parents who simply stopped eating so their children could have more. Mothers served dinner to their families, claimed they'd already eaten or weren't hungry, and went to bed with empty stomachs. Fathers gave their portions to kids and pretended they preferred coffee for dinner. These sacrifices happened silently, daily, without martyrdom or complaint. Just parents slowly starving themselves so their children might survive. The psychological toll of eating like this was immense. Food is supposed to provide pleasure, comfort, and social connection. Depression-era meals provided calories and shame. Families ate their water soup in silence, everyone pretending it was fine, nobody admitting that they'd gone to bed hungry for the 14th night in a row. The humiliation of being reduced to eating weeds, catching sparrows, and raiding garbage cans destroyed something fundamental in people's sense of dignity and self-worth. You weren't just hungry. You were degraded by your own hunger, forced to eat in ways that felt subhuman. And the truly maddening part, there was food. Farms were destroying crops they couldn't sell. Warehouses held surplus goods. The problem wasn't scarcity. It was an economic system so broken that food and hungry people couldn't find each other. If you had a baby or toddler during the Great Depression, winter was a constant terror. Infants couldn't regulate their body temperature. They needed warmth, nutrition, and constant care, all things in desperately short supply. Mothers wrapped babies in every scrap of cloth they owned. tucked them into bed between siblings for warmth, and prayed they'd make it through the night. Infant mortality spiked, malnutrition stunted growth, and even if your child survived, you knew the trauma of cold and hunger would follow them for life. Babies born during the Depression faced immediate disadvantages. Many mothers were malnourished during pregnancy, which meant babies were born underweight, premature, or with developmental problems. Without prenatal care, which cost money nobody had, complications went undetected until birth when it was too late. Home births attended by midwives or relatives were standard, and while many went fine, the ones that didn't often ended in tragedy. A baby born blue, not breathing properly, or with the umbilical cord wrapped around its neck needed immediate medical intervention. At home, in the middle of winter, with no phone to call for help, that intervention didn't exist. If a baby survived birth, the next challenge was keeping it warm. Newborns can't shiver. They can't generate heat effectively. They depend entirely on external warmth, which in a Depression-era home meant blankets, body heat, and desperate improvisation. Mothers wrapped infants in layers of cloth, old sweaters, flour sack fabric, whatever was available. Some placed babies in dresser drawers lined with blankets, creating makeshift cribs that provided a tiny bit of insulation. At night, babies slept between parents or siblings, sharing body heat in beds that were already overcrowded. The cold could kill babies quickly and quietly. Hypothermia in infants doesn't look dramatic. The baby just becomes very still, very quiet. They stop crying. They stop moving. Their skin turns pale or bluish. Parents who didn't know better might think the baby was finally sleeping peacefully, when actually the baby was dying. Some mothers woke to find their infants cold and unresponsive, victims of a freezing house that had dropped below survivable temperatures during the night. Feeding babies was another nightmare. If a mother could breastfeed, the baby had a chance, assuming the mother was getting enough nutrition to produce milk. Many weren't. Malnourished mothers produced insufficient milk or milk with poor nutritional content. Their bodies, already struggling to keep them alive, couldn't support milk production. Babies would nurse constantly, never getting full, slowly starving while attached to their mother's empty breasts. Formula existed but was expensive and required clean water and bottles, both of which were luxuries. Cow's milk was the common alternative, but you needed money to buy milk, and you needed a way to keep it from spoiling. Many families diluted milk heavily with water to make it stretch further, which meant babies were getting even fewer calories and nutrients. Some families couldn't afford milk at all, and fed babies sugar water, or thin cereal mixed with water, nutritionally inadequate substitutes that kept babies technically alive but slowly starving. Toddlers faced different but equally serious challenges. They were mobile, curious, and completely unable to understand why there was no food, or why the house was so cold. A 2-year-old doesn't comprehend economic depression. They just know they're hungry and cold, and they cry about it constantly until crying takes too much energy. Then they become quiet, listless, staring at nothing with the 1,000-yard stare of trauma that no child should have. Malnutrition in young children had devastating effects. Without adequate protein, calcium, and vitamins, their bodies couldn't develop properly. Bones didn't grow strong, leading to rickets, a disease where legs bow under the body's weight. Teeth came in malformed or didn't come in at all. Growth was stunted, leaving children significantly smaller than they should have been for their age. Some of this damage was permanent. Children who survived depression malnutrition carried the physical effects their entire lives. Shorter stature, weaker bones, dental problems, and compromised immune systems. The psychological impact on parents was crushing. Watching your baby cry from hunger when you have no food is a special kind of torture. Feeling your toddler's cold hands and knowing you can't warm them. Seeing your child's ribs through their skin. These experiences broke parents in ways that never fully healed. Mothers blamed themselves even though the failure was economic, not personal. Fathers felt emasculated by their inability to provide. The guilt was overwhelming and permanent. Some parents made impossible decisions. When food was scarce, who ate? If you had 3 children and only enough food for 2, what do you do? Some parents practiced brutal triage, giving more food to older children who had better survival odds, while babies and toddlers got less. It was rational but monstrous, and parents lived with that guilt forever. illness was particularly deadly for young children. A cold that would make an adult miserable could kill a malnourished toddler. Pneumonia, whooping cough, measles, diphtheria. These diseases ripped through Depression-era families. Without vaccines, without antibiotics, without access to doctors, parents could only watch as their children's fevers climbed, as their breathing became laboured, as they slipped away despite every prayer and desperate remedy. Some families lost multiple children in a single winter. Disease would take one child, then spread to siblings living in close quarters. Parents would bury a child, come home to another sick one, and brace themselves for more loss. Child mortality during the Depression wasn't uncommon or shocking. It was grimly expected, just another cruelty in a decade of cruelties. Remarkably, many babies and toddlers did survive, testament to both their resilience and their parents' fierce determination. Mothers who hadn't eaten in days still got up at night to nurse their babies. Fathers worked brutal hours for pennies to buy milk. Siblings shared their portions without being asked. Families pulled together, sacrificing everything for the smallest members. But survival came at a cost. Children who lived through Depression winters carried the experience in their bodies and minds. They grew up hypervigilant about food security, unable to throw anything away, terrified of poverty's return. The trauma embedded itself so deeply that it shaped their entire lives and the way they raised their own children. The babies who survived those winters became the generation that fought World War II, built the middle class, and swore their children would never know hunger or cold. They succeeded mostly, but they never forgot what it felt like to be small, freezing and hungry, wondering if morning would come. Thousands of men, and some women, became hobos, hopping freight trains in search of work, warmth, or just a change of scenery. Riding the rails in winter was brutal. The trains weren't heated. You crouched in empty boxcars or clung to the undercarriage, exposed to freezing wind and snow. Railroad bulls, hired guards, beat or arrested trespassers. Frostbite and hypothermia claimed lives. But staying in one place meant starving, so people kept moving town to town, state to state, chasing rumours of jobs that never materialised and hoping the next stop wouldn't be their last. The hobo phenomenon exploded during the Depression. At its peak, an estimated 2 million people were riding the rails, about 250,000 of them teenagers who'd left home to ease the burden on their families or search for opportunities that didn't exist. These weren't career drifters or romantic wanderers. They were desperate people who'd tried everything else and had nothing left except motion. If you couldn't find work in your town, maybe the next town over had something. It never did, but hope kept people moving. Catching a freight train required timing, courage, and luck. Trains didn't stop for passengers who weren't paying. You had to run alongside a moving train, grab whatever handhold you could find, and pull yourself aboard while the train picked up speed. People mistimed jumps and fell under the wheels. Others grabbed weak handholds and got dragged. Railroad workers later estimated that about 6,500 people died each year during the Depression from train-related accidents. That's roughly 18 deaths per day, every day, for a decade. Once aboard, if you'd successfully grabbed on without losing any limbs, you had to find somewhere to ride. Empty boxcars were the prize. They had walls, floors, and some protection from wind. You could huddle in a corner with other riders, share stories, and pretend the freezing metal box was almost shelter. But boxcars were often locked or full, leaving you with worse options. The roof, the space between cars, or underneath the train on the rods, metal bars that ran beneath the cars where you'd cling for dear life while the tracks blurred inches from your face. Riding on top of boxcars in winter was suicidal. The wind hit you at 60 miles per hour. Snow and ice pelted your face. You'd lie flat, grabbing onto anything you could, trying to stay low to avoid bridges and tunnels that would decapitate you. People froze to death on top of trains. Their bodies not discovered until the train reached its destination. Others fell off when they fell asleep or lost their grip, tumbling onto tracks or into ravines. Riding the rods underneath was even more dangerous. You'd lie on narrow metal bars, the ground rushing past beneath you, train wheels churning on both sides, praying your frozen fingers didn't lose their grip. Cinders and sparks from the engine flew back, burning holes in your clothes and skin. If you dozed off, you died. If your hands cramped from cold, you died. If the train made an unexpected stop and you didn't react fast enough, you got crushed. It was transportation for people who decided that maybe dying quickly was better than starving slowly. Railroad bulls were the hired security guards whose job was to keep hobos off the trains. Some were relatively humane, just chasing riders away. Others were sadistic, beating people with clubs, shooting at them, or throwing them off moving trains. There are documented cases of bulls murdering hobos and nothing happening because a dead transient wasn't worth investigating. You rode the rails knowing that getting caught might mean a beating, arrest, or worse. In winter, the dangers multiplied exponentially. That empty boxcar you were riding in, it was a metal icebox. The temperature inside was barely warmer than outside, and metal conducts cold efficiently. You'd huddle with other riders, sharing body heat, maybe burning scraps of paper or wood in a makeshift fire, risking asphyxiation from smoke in an enclosed space. Some riders froze to death in boxcars overnight, their bodies discovered the next morning stiff and blue. Hobo jungles appeared near railroad yards, temporary camps where riders could rest, share food, and exchange information. These weren't pleasant campsites. They were collections of makeshift shelters, fire pits, and desperate people, all trying to survive until the next train. In winter, the jungles were miserable, muddy, cold, and often raided by police who'd arrest everyone for vagrancy. But they offered some community, some shared knowledge about which towns had food, which railroad bulls were dangerous, and which trains were heading where. The Hobo Code developed, a system of symbols drawn on fences and buildings to communicate information. A cat drawing meant a kind woman lived there who might give food. A triangle with hands meant the homeowner had a gun. Crossed lines meant the town was hostile to hobos. These symbols created a network of information that could mean the difference between eating and starving, between finding shelter and freezing. Women and teenagers riding the rails faced additional dangers. Sexual assault was common. Young people were particularly vulnerable, preyed upon by other riders or by people in the towns they passed through. Some disguised themselves as boys, cutting their hair, binding their chests, adopting male names and mannerisms. It helped sometimes, not always. The tragic irony was that all this dangerous movement rarely resulted in finding work. Riders would arrive in a new town, discover it had the same unemployment problems as everywhere else, and hop another train. They were caught in perpetual motion, chasing rumours and false hope, burning calories they couldn't replace, wearing out their bodies and spirits while going nowhere. The railroad became a treadmill of desperation, offering the illusion of progress while delivering only exhaustion and danger. Some riders never came home. They died under trains, froze to death in boxcars, were murdered by railroad bulls, or simply disappeared into the vast network of tracks and forgotten towns. Families lost track of fathers, sons, and brothers who'd left promising to send money and were never heard from again. The railroads during the Depression weren't romantic adventures. They were mobile cemeteries, carrying thousands of desperate souls on a journey that usually ended badly. But people kept riding because the alternative, sitting still while starvation approached, felt worse. At least on a train, you were doing something. At least you were trying. Even if trying meant clinging to frozen metal bars while the winter wind tried to peel you off and the railroad bulls tried to beat you unconscious, and the destination was just another town with no work and no hope. For farmers, winter during the Great Depression was the final insult after years of drought, dust storms, and collapsing crop prices. Their fields were barren. Their livestock was starving. Many couldn't afford to feed their animals, so they shot them rather than watch them suffer. Winter wheat, the crop that was supposed to save them, refused to grow in the dusty, depleted soil. Families sat in cold farmhouses surrounded by land they'd worked for generations and realised it was all over. The farm wasn't coming back. The only question was whether they'd leave before or after they froze to death. The collapse of American agriculture during the Depression was a slow-motion catastrophe that peaked in winter. It started with crop prices falling in the 1920s, continued through the stock market crash, and accelerated with the drought that began in 1930 and lasted through most of the decade. By the time winter rolled around each year, farmers were already devastated. Winter just piled more misery onto the existing heap. Let's talk about what happens when your crops fail year after year. First you lose income, then you can't pay your mortgage, then the bank forecloses. This happened to hundreds of thousands of farmers during the Depression. Families who'd owned their land for generations, who'd survived the Civil War and World War I, who'd built their entire identity around working the soil, suddenly got letters telling them they had 30 days to vacate. Foreclosure sales became community tragedies where neighbours watched families' possessions auctioned off for pennies on the dollar. Some communities organised penny auctions where locals would bid 1 cent for items, intimidate any outside bidders, and then return everything to the foreclosed family. It was small-scale rebellion against an economic system that had failed them completely. The livestock situation was heartbreaking. Cattle, horses, pigs, chickens, all these animals that represented wealth, investment and livelihood, were starving because farmers couldn't afford feed. The drought had killed the pastures. The dust storms had buried what little grass remained. Farmers faced an impossible choice: watch their animals starve slowly or kill them quickly. Most chose the latter because letting an animal suffer was unconscionable, even if killing it meant destroying your own financial future. Picture a farmer walking into his barn in January, rifle in hand, to shoot the dairy cow that's been part of the family for years. The cow that his children named, the cow that's provided milk, butter and income. But now the cow's ribs are showing she's too weak to stand, and there's no food to give her, so he shoots her. Then he shoots the other cows, then the horses. Then he sits in the barn surrounded by dead animals and realises he's just destroyed his entire operation. Even if the rain came tomorrow, even if crops miraculously grew next year, he no longer had livestock to work the land or produce income. Some farmers sold their animals for slaughter at prices so low it was basically giving them away. A cow that should have sold for $50 went for $5. Pigs that represented months of investment sold for the price of a loaf of bread. Farmers took these insulting prices because getting something was better than getting nothing, and they needed cash for food, fuel, or mortgage payments. But it felt like defeat. Like admitting that decades of work had been reduced to bargain basement prices. The winter wheat crop was supposed to be the salvation of Great Plains farmers. You planted it in fall, it grew through winter, and you harvested it in early summer. Winter wheat was hardy, drought-resistant, and had saved farmers through difficult times before, but during the Depression, even winter wheat failed. The soil was too depleted, too damaged by over-farming and erosion. Seeds went into the ground and nothing came up, or tiny shoots appeared and immediately died from lack of moisture. Farmers watched their fields remain brown and barren through winter, knowing that if the winter wheat failed, there would be no harvest, no income, no way to survive another year. The farmhouses themselves became monuments to failure. These weren't quaint country cottages. They were drafty wooden structures, often decades old, in desperate need of repairs that couldn't be afforded. Paint was peeling, roofs were leaking, windows were broken and patched with cardboard. The farms had always been modest, but when times were good, they'd been maintained. Now they were falling apart, literally crumbling while their owners lived inside them. Farm families faced unique isolation. In cities, you had neighbours close by, soup kitchens and bread lines. On farms, you were miles from anyone. If you ran out of food, you couldn't walk to a charity. If you got sick, you couldn't reach a doctor. If you needed help, there was no one to call. You were alone on your dying land, watching dust blow across fields that used to grow food, surrounded by silence that used to be filled with animal sounds and the noise of productive work. Children on failing farms grew up fast. They understood what foreclosure meant. They watched their parents despair. They saw animals shot and buried. They felt the cold more acutely because there was no fuel to burn. They went to bed hungry because the farm that used to produce food now produced only dust and debt. Some farm children later said they didn't realise how poor they were because everyone around them was equally desperate. Others said they knew exactly how poor they were, and the knowledge crushed them. The psychological destruction of farmers was profound. Farming wasn't just a job, it was an identity, a generational legacy, a relationship with the land. When the land failed, or more accurately, when farmers' overuse of the land caused it to fail, they didn't just lose income, they lost purpose, they lost their sense of who they were. Men who defined themselves as providers, as stewards of the earth, as independent landowners, became unemployed welfare recipients. The shame was overwhelming. Some farmers couldn't handle it. Suicide rates among rural populations increased significantly during the Depression. Men walked into their barns and didn't come out. They drove trucks into trees. They took rifles meant for hunting and turned them on themselves. Their families found them and added grief to the already unbearable weight of poverty and desperation. Those who didn't take their own lives often made the agonizing decision to leave. They abandoned farms that had been in their families for generations, loading whatever possessions fit into trucks, and joined the migration west toward California, where rumors promised agricultural work. These weren't adventures. They were desperate retreats from land that had become hostile, from banks that had become enemies, from communities that had become ghost towns. The ones who stayed, whether from stubbornness, lack of options, or hope that next year would be better, endured winter after winter in conditions that would have broken most people. They ate their seed corn. They burned their fences for warmth. They wore clothes until they were rags. And they wondered what they'd done to deserve this punishment, unable to understand that they hadn't done anything wrong except trust that the land and the economy would hold up under pressure. Neither did. Christmas during the Great Depression wasn't about joy or giving. It was about pretending everything was fine for the sake of the children. There were no store-bought gifts. Parents made toys from scraps, dolls from rags, wooden cars from scrap lumber. Stockings hung empty. Christmas dinner, if there was one, might be a scrawny chicken or a pot of beans. Churches and charities tried to help, distributing donated food and toys, but there was never enough. The holiday became a painful reminder of everything families had lost, wrapped in forced smiles and carols sung through chattering teeth. The weeks leading up to Christmas were particularly cruel because advertisements and store windows still displayed abundance that no one could afford. Department stores decorated elaborate window displays with toys, food, and clothing that might as well have been on Mars for all the accessibility they offered to Depression-era families. Children pressed their faces against the glass, staring at dolls, train sets, and bicycles they'd never own. Parents walked past quickly, unable to bear the weight of their children's longing and their own failure to provide. For children who'd experienced Christmas before the Depression, the contrast was devastating. They remembered years when there had been gifts under a tree, when stockings had been filled with oranges, nuts, and candy, when Christmas dinner had been a feast. Now their parents were telling them that Santa was having a hard year, or that he was focusing on needier children. Explanations that made no sense because what children could be needier than them? The homemade gifts parents managed to create were testaments to love and ingenuity, but they couldn't hide the desperation behind them. Mothers stayed up late by dim lamplight, sewing dolls from flour sacks, stuffing them with rags, and embroidering faces with whatever thread they could find. Fathers carved wooden toys in cold garages, turning scraps of lumber into crude cars, horses, or blocks. These toys were treasured not because they were good, but because children understood the sacrifice they represented. Many families simply couldn't manage gifts at all. Parents had to tell their children there would be no Christmas this year, watching their kids try to process that information. Some children cried, others accepted it with a resigned sadness that was worse than crying. The older kids, the ones who understood what was happening, pretended they were too old for gifts anyway, trying to make their parents feel less guilty. It didn't work. The Christmas tree, a tradition that seems essential now, was a luxury many families skipped. Why buy a tree when you couldn't afford food? Some families cut small branches from whatever trees they could find, propping them in jars and calling them Christmas trees. Others drew trees on walls or hung a single string of old decorations to mark the holiday. A few families who still had trees decorated them with popcorn strings, paper chains made from newspaper, and ornaments crafted from tin cans. It looked festive if you didn't think too hard about what it represented. Christmas dinner was supposed to be special, a rare feast that broke the monotony of Depression meals. For many families, it was just another day of inadequate food with slightly more disappointment. The traditional turkey was completely unaffordable. A turkey cost several dollars, which was a week's worth of breadline meals for a family. Chicken was the substitute if you were lucky, and even then, it would be a scrawny bird that barely fed a family. Some families had rabbit, squirrel, or whatever could be hunted or trapped. Others had beans, potatoes, or soup, the same food they ate every other day, just served with more forced enthusiasm. Christmas oranges were a particularly painful tradition. Before the Depression, oranges were a Christmas treat, something special from warm climates that children looked forward to finding in their stockings. During the Depression, a single orange could cost 10 or 15 cents, an impossible luxury. Some charities distributed oranges to children, and kids who received them treasured them like gold, often refusing to eat them for days, just carrying them around and smelling them, trying to make the gift last. Churches and charitable organizations organized Christmas programs, distributing food baskets and donated toys to families in need. These programs helped thousands of children experience at least some version of Christmas, but the logistics were overwhelming and the supplies inadequate. Charities received 10 times more requests than they had resources to fulfill. They had to choose which families were deserving, a soul-crushing process that often excluded families who needed help just as desperately as those who received it. The toy distributions were particularly difficult. Charities collected used toys, refurbished them, and gave them to children at Christmas parties. Kids lined up, received a single toy, maybe a doll with a missing arm, a wooden truck with no wheels, a game with half its pieces missing, and were expected to be grateful. And they were grateful, heartbreakingly so, thanking volunteers profusely for toys that other children had discarded as trash. It was charity at its most necessary and most humiliating. Christmas carols took on darker meanings. "I'll be home for Christmas" became painful for families separated by the search for work. "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas," with its original lyrics about making do with troubles and gathering our loved ones near, felt less like a cheerful suggestion and more like a desperate plea. White Christmas romanticized snow that in reality was burying people in frozen Hoovervilles and making travel impossible for families trying to reunite. The radio provided some relief. Families who still had electricity could listen to Christmas programs, comedy shows, and music that offered temporary escape from their circumstances. For a few hours on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, you could listen to music and pretend your life wasn't a disaster. Then the program ended and you were back in your cold house with your hungry children and your empty stockings. The emotional toll on parents was crushing. Mothers cried in private, mourning their inability to give their children a real Christmas. Fathers felt like failures, their masculinity and purpose undermined by poverty they couldn't control. Older siblings tried to compensate, telling younger ones stories, playing games, creating entertainment from nothing to distract from what Christmas had become. Some families tried to maintain traditions despite everything. They sang carols, read the Christmas story, and gathered together even without gifts or food. They focused on togetherness, on gratitude for what they still had, each other mostly, and tried to find meaning in survival itself. It was forced optimism, but it was also resilience, the stubborn human refusal to let circumstances completely destroy hope. But let's be honest, Christmas during the Depression mostly sucked. It was a holiday designed to celebrate abundance forced upon people who had nothing. It highlighted every loss, every failure, every broken promise. It asked children to believe in magic when their daily reality was hunger and cold. It demanded joy from people who were drowning in despair, and yet somehow families got through it. They woke up on December 26th, put away the makeshift decorations, and went back to the work of surviving. Christmas hadn't saved them, it hadn't fixed anything, but they'd made it through another holiday without giving up completely. That, in Depression winters, counted as victory. Desperate times led to desperate crimes, and one of the most common was coal theft. Families sent their children to scavenge along railroad tracks, picking up chunks of coal that had fallen from trains. Others broke into coal yards at night, stealing just enough to heat their homes for a few days. Technically it was illegal. Morally, it was survival. Police often looked the other way, knowing that arresting a freezing family wouldn't solve anything. Still, some people were caught, fined, or jailed. The crime of trying not to die was prosecuted more often than you'd think. Coal was currency during Depression winters. A bucket of coal could keep your stove burning for a day or two. A bag of coal was a week of warmth. But coal cost money, and money was the one thing nobody had. So people improvised, bending or breaking laws that suddenly seemed less important than not freezing to death. The moral calculus was simple: steal coal or watch your children turn blue from cold. Most people chose theft. The railroad tracks became hunting grounds for coal scavengers. When freight trains hauled coal from mines to cities, chunks would inevitably fall off the cars onto the tracks and the ground alongside them. This spillage had always existed, but during the Depression it became a vital resource. Children usually were sent to walk the tracks, picking up pieces of coal and filling burlap sacks or buckets. It was technically trespassing on railroad property, but the railroad companies initially looked the other way. It was just spillage, after all. But as more families became desperate, the amount of spillage mysteriously increased. Suddenly coal wasn't just falling off trains, it was being helped off trains by people with sticks and crowbars who'd whack at passing coal cars, knocking chunks loose. Others waited at curves or hills where trains slowed down, jumped aboard and threw coal off before jumping down again. This escalated from scavenging to outright theft, and the railroad companies noticed their profits decreasing. They fought back. Railroad bulls, those security guards who already terrorized hobos, now also targeted coal scavengers. They patrolled tracks, chasing away families, confiscating their coal, sometimes beating people they caught. Children were particularly vulnerable, easier to catch, less likely to fight back. Some bulls were relatively humane, just taking the coal and sending kids home. Others were vicious, hitting children with clubs, threatening to shoot them, or dragging them to police stations where their parents would be fined amounts they absolutely could not pay. Coal yards, the storage facilities where coal was kept before distribution, became targets for nighttime raids. Families would wait until dark, climb fences or break through weak spots, fill sacks with coal, and run before guards noticed. It was burglary, no question. But it was also survival. The coal companies lost inventory while families gained a few days of heat. The companies responded with higher fences, more guards, and aggressive prosecution. Getting caught stealing coal could mean serious consequences. Courts processed hundreds of coal theft cases during Depression winters. Judges faced impossible decisions: convict a mother for stealing coal to heat her home, and fine her money she didn't have, or let her go and signal that theft was acceptable. Most judges tried to find middle ground: suspended sentences, minimal fines, stern warnings, but some prosecuted aggressively, believing that maintaining law and order required punishing theft regardless of motive. Jail time for coal theft was rare but not unheard of. Repeat offenders, or people caught stealing large amounts, sometimes received sentences of days or weeks. This was counterproductive cruelty. Jailing someone meant their family had even less support and more reason to steal. But the legal system wasn't designed for economic catastrophe. It was designed for normal times when theft was a moral failing, not a survival strategy. The coal theft phenomenon created uncomfortable moral questions that communities had to navigate. Was it wrong to steal coal if your children were freezing? Was it wrong for coal companies to prosecute desperate families? What about the children being used as coal thieves? Were they criminals or victims? Different people answered differently, creating tensions that played out in courtrooms, churches, and dinner table debates. Some communities organised in response. Neighbours would pool resources to buy coal collectively, getting better prices and sharing the load. Churches collected coal donations for the neediest families. Local governments sometimes distributed small amounts of coal through relief programs. But these efforts were never sufficient. There was always more need than coal. Police officers found themselves in difficult positions. They knew the families stealing coal. These weren't hardened criminals, they were former neighbours, workers, ordinary people pushed to desperation. Many officers simply didn't enforce coal theft laws unless forced to by complaints from coal companies. They'd see children along the tracks and pretend not to notice. They'd catch someone climbing a coal yard fence and tell them to go home instead of arresting them. Enforcement was selective and merciful when possible. But selective enforcement created its own problems. Some people got away with coal theft while others were prosecuted, often depending on which officer caught them, which judge heard their case, or how aggressive the local coal company was about pressing charges. Justice became arbitrary, another source of unfairness in a decade defined by unfairness. The coal company's perspective was also complicated. They were businesses trying to survive the Depression too. Their sales were down, their profits marginal. Every ton of stolen coal was money lost, inventory they couldn't sell. They had shareholders, employees depending on their survival, and legitimate reasons to protect their property. But prosecuting freezing families created terrible optics. Coal companies that were too aggressive faced public backlash and boycotts, while companies that were too lenient faced continued theft. Some coal dealers actually became more generous during the Depression, extending credit to families who couldn't pay, delivering coal first and hoping for payment later. Many of these businesses went under because too many customers never paid. Other dealers became harder, demanding cash up front, refusing credit, protecting their bottom line at the expense of community relationships. Both approaches made sense from certain perspectives. Both created hardship. The desperation drove innovation in coal alternatives. People burned anything that would produce heat. Corn cobs, dried dung, scrap wood, old furniture, newspapers twisted into logs. These alternatives burned fast and produced less heat than coal, but they were free and legal. Still, when you had the choice between scrounging for corn cobs all day or grabbing a bucket of actual coal from the railroad tracks, the temptation was overwhelming. The moral dimension of coal theft highlighted a fundamental problem with Depression-era America. Laws and economic systems designed for prosperity didn't work during catastrophic failure. Prosecuting theft made sense when society was functioning. But when a quarter of the country was unemployed and families were freezing, enforcing property rights felt like protecting the rich at the expense of the dying poor. Yet not enforcing them meant abandoning rule of law entirely. This tension never resolved. It just persisted through the entire Depression, creating thousands of individual tragedies where people faced prosecution for trying to stay warm, where children were criminalized for picking up coal, where desperate survival was legally defined as theft. The coal sat in yards, protected by fences and guards, while families froze blocks away. The trains continued hauling coal across the country, while children walked the tracks looking for scraps. The system that should have distributed heat to those who needed it failed completely, and the gap was filled by petty crime, selective enforcement, and a moral quagmire nobody could solve. Winter storms during the 1930s weren't just inconvenient, they were catastrophic. Blizzards buried roads, trapped families in their homes, and killed livestock by the hundreds. In rural areas, towns could be cut off for days or weeks. No supplies, no communication, no help. People burned furniture to stay warm and rationed their last cans of food. Some froze to death in their beds. Others died trying to reach neighbours or town. The blizzards were merciless, piling snow higher than doors and windows, turning the landscape into a frozen tomb. The blizzards of the 1930s were meteorologically exceptional, made worse by the economic catastrophe that left communities unable to respond. When a blizzard hit in better times, towns had resources, stockpiled food, fuel reserves, equipment to clear roads. During the Depression, towns had nothing. Roads went unploughed because municipalities couldn't afford fuel for snowplows. Communication lines went unrepaired because there was no money for maintenance. People faced storms with depleted supplies and no way to get more. The storms themselves were monsters. Wind speeds reached 50 or 60 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally, creating whiteout conditions where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Snow accumulated at rates of several inches per hour, building drifts 20 or 30 feet high. These weren't the picturesque snow days you see on greeting cards. These were survival events where the wrong decision meant death. When a blizzard approached, if you had warning at all, you made preparations. You brought livestock into barns or as close to structures as possible. You filled every container with water before the well froze. You gathered whatever fuel you could find. You pulled children inside and prayed the storm would pass quickly. Then the snow started, and all you could do was wait and watch as your world disappeared under white. The isolation was terrifying. Rural families could be miles from neighbours, connected to the outside world only by roads that vanished under snowdrifts within hours. The telephone lines, if they existed, usually went down early in the storm, weighted by ice or snapped by wind. You were cut off completely, trapped in your house with whatever supplies you had, hoping they'd last until the storm ended and someone could reach you. Some storms lasted days, not light snow, but continuous, heavy blizzards that buried everything. You'd wake up and find snow had drifted against your door, sealing it shut. You'd have to dig out from inside, shoveling snow back into your house just to create a passage to outside. Windows disappeared under snow. The house became a cave, dark and claustrophobic, with snow pressed against every opening. Fuel ran out quickly. That woodpile you'd rationed so carefully, gone in 2 days when you're burning constantly to fight temperatures that dropped to 20 below. Families started burning furniture. First the extra chair nobody used, then the broken dresser, then the good furniture, because at this point, freezing to death seemed more immediate than future regret about destroying your grandmother's rocking chair. Some people burned floorboards, their own walls, anything made of wood that would fit in the stove. Food supplies dwindled. Whatever you had in your pantry had to last until roads could be cleared and supplies could reach you. That might be a week, might be 2 weeks, might be longer. Families rationed their canned goods, stretching meals to the point where dinner was one shared can of beans for 6 people. Children cried from hunger while snow continued to fall outside, piling higher, trapping them deeper. Livestock died by the hundreds. Cattle and horses trapped in fields during blizzards froze to death standing up, their bodies becoming ice sculptures buried under snow. Others suffocated in barns when snow drifted against doors and blocked ventilation. Farmers who'd managed to keep animals alive through the drought and depression watched helplessly as storms finished what economic collapse had started. Spring thaws revealed fields full of dead animals, their frozen corpses emerging from melting snow like horrible surprises. People died, too. Some froze to death in their beds when their fuel ran out and temperatures inside their houses dropped below survivable levels. Others died trying to reach help, walking to a neighbour's house or into town, getting disoriented in whiteout conditions, wandering in circles until exhaustion and hypothermia took them. Their bodies weren't found until spring, sometimes just yards from safety they couldn't see. The phenomenon of getting lost between your house and barn was common enough to have a name: barn blindness. Farmers would tie ropes between house and barn so they could feel their way back and forth during storms. Without the rope, you could step outside, lose sight of your house in blowing snow, and wander until you died, even though safety was 20 feet away. Multiple Depression-era deaths happened this way. People found frozen within sight of their homes, killed by disorientation and wind. Children were particularly vulnerable during extended blizzards. They needed more food, more warmth, more care. Parents made impossible choices about how to ration limited supplies. Some families sent children to bed early to conserve heat and calories. Others kept them in bed all day, tucked under every available blanket, minimizing movement to reduce calorie burn. It was survival calculation at its most brutal, measuring how long your child could go without food versus how long until the storm ended. Communication blackouts meant that even when storms ended, nobody knew who'd survived. Rescue efforts were delayed, disorganized, ineffective. Roads remained impassable for days after snowfall stopped. Towns sent out search parties when they could, looking for stranded families, digging out farmhouses, checking on the elderly. Sometimes they found everyone alive. Sometimes they didn't. The psychological trauma of being trapped during a blizzard was intense and lasting. The helplessness of watching snow pile higher while your supplies dwindled. The terror of darkness when your lamp oil ran out. The cold that penetrated deeper each day. The hunger that became constant pain. People who survived depression blizzards carried the memory forever, developing anxieties about winter, about being trapped, about running out of supplies. Some refused to live in rural areas after their experiences. Others became obsessive hoarders, unable to feel safe without excessive stockpiles of food and fuel. The storms also revealed who people really were. Some neighbours broke through snowdrifts to check on each other, sharing food and fuel they barely had enough of themselves. Others hoarded their supplies and refused to help, justifying selfishness as self-preservation. Communities that pulled together survived better than isolated individuals. But pulling together required resources many people simply didn't have. Weather prediction in the 1930s was primitive compared to now. Storms often arrived with little warning. Radio broadcasts might give vague alerts if you had a radio and electricity. Otherwise, you relied on weather signs, atmospheric pressure, animal behaviour, old folklore, and hoped you read them correctly. By the time you realised a major blizzard was coming, it was often too late to adequately prepare. The aftermath of blizzards was almost as difficult as the storms themselves. Digging out required enormous effort when people were already weakened by cold and hunger. Snow had to be shoveled from doors, roofs, pathways. Livestock had to be checked, the living separated from the dead. Damage had to be assessed, broken windows, collapsed structures, frozen pipes, and all of this with inadequate tools, insufficient food, and the knowledge that another storm could hit any time. The blizzards of Depression winters didn't just bring snow, they brought a concentrated dose of everything that made the era unbearable: isolation, helplessness, hunger, cold, death, packed into a few days of white hell that tested the absolute limits of human endurance. Many people didn't pass the test. It wasn't just the economy that collapsed. It was hope. The relentless cold, hunger, and uncertainty broke people mentally. Suicide rates spiked. Families fractured under the strain. Men who'd been providers felt worthless. Women stretched every resource to its breaking point and still couldn't feed their children. Despair wasn't poetic. It was grey, numbing, and constant. People shuffled through their days like ghosts, surviving but not living. The winters weren't just cold. They were dark in every sense of the word. The psychological devastation of the Great Depression is harder to quantify than unemployment rates or crop failures, but it was just as real and possibly more damaging long term. You can rebuild an economy. You can't easily repair a shattered sense of self-worth or the trauma of watching your family slowly starve while being powerless to help them. The mental health crisis of the 1930s was never properly addressed, because mental health wasn't really acknowledged as a legitimate medical concern. You were just supposed to endure, to pull yourself up by your bootstraps to stay strong. And when you couldn't, when the weight became too much, you broke quietly and alone. Suicide rates increased significantly during the Depression years. Exact statistics are difficult because many suicides were unreported or misclassified as accidents, especially in rural areas, but evidence from cities where records were better maintained shows a clear spike. In 1929, before the crash, the suicide rate was around 14 per 100,000 people. By 1932, it had jumped to over 17 per 100,000. That might not sound like much, but it represents thousands of additional deaths. People who couldn't see a way forward and chose permanent escape from temporary, though seemingly endless, circumstances. Men were particularly vulnerable. The 1930s masculine identity was tied almost entirely to being a provider. A man's worth was measured by his ability to support his family through work, to put food on the table, to keep a roof overhead. When millions of men lost their jobs through no fault of their own, they didn't just lose income, they lost their identity, their purpose, their sense of manhood. Some men literally couldn't leave their houses because the shame of being unemployed was too overwhelming. They'd sit at home while their wives went to soup kitchens, unable to face the public acknowledgement of their failure. The humiliation of accepting charity destroyed men psychologically. Standing in bread lines, taking handouts from relief agencies, watching your wife work while you stayed unemployed. Each of these was a wound to masculine pride that 1930s culture had taught men to protect above everything else. Some men simply couldn't handle it. They'd walk into garages, start cars, and let carbon monoxide do its work. They'd take rifles into barns. They'd walk into winter storms without coats and keep walking. Suicide became an escape from shame that felt worse than death. Women faced different but equally crushing psychological burdens. They were expected to hold families together emotionally while also managing household economics that couldn't possibly balance. They stretched inadequate food across too many meals. They mended clothes that were beyond mending. They smiled and reassured children while privately despairing. They absorbed everyone else's fear and sadness while having no outlet for their own. The pressure was enormous, and many women collapsed under it, developing what we'd now recognise as depression, anxiety, and stress-related illnesses, but what was then dismissed as female hysteria or nerves. The constant anxiety about survival created a state of permanent stress that rewired people's brains. Every day brought new problems with no solutions. Will there be food tomorrow? Can we pay rent? Will the children get sick? Is it cold enough that we risk hypothermia tonight? This wasn't occasional stress. It was relentless, grinding daily terror about basic survival. The human stress response isn't designed to be activated constantly for years. Prolonged stress causes physical changes in the brain, damaging the hippocampus, affecting memory and emotional regulation. Depression-era adults literally experience brain damage from chronic stress. Children absorbed their parents' trauma and developed their own. They saw their fathers cry, their mothers skip meals, their siblings get sick. They understood, even when parents tried to hide it, that things were desperately wrong. Many children developed anxiety disorders that persisted into adulthood. Others became hypervigilant, unable to relax, always watching for the next disaster. The trauma embedded itself so deeply that it affected their parenting decades later, creating generational cycles of anxiety about scarcity and security. Families fractured under pressure that no relationship could withstand. Marriages ended not from lack of love but from accumulated stress and blame. Husbands left to search for work and never came back. Wives packed up children and moved in with relatives, abandoning homes they could no longer maintain. Siblings who'd been close became estranged over inherited burdens or scarce resources. The Depression didn't just separate families geographically. It damaged relationships in ways that never fully healed. Domestic violence increased. Frustrated, emasculated, desperate men sometimes took their anger out on wives and children. Women overwhelmed by responsibility and fear lashed out at kids. It wasn't excusable, but it was understandable in the context of people pushed far beyond their psychological limits. Nobody was their best self during the Depression. Many people became their worst selves, and their families paid the price. The lack of mental health resources meant people suffered without help. There were few psychiatrists, and they served primarily wealthy patients. Therapy was expensive and considered frivolous or shameful. Psychiatric hospitals existed but were terrible. Overcrowded, underfunded institutions where treatment was often worse than the illness. Most people with mental health crises just suffered at home, self-medicating with alcohol when they could afford it, or simply enduring until they couldn't anymore. Alcohol abuse spiked despite prohibition lasting until 1933. Bootleg liquor provided temporary escape from unbearable reality. Men drank to forget their failures. Women drank to quiet their fears. The quality of illegal alcohol was often poor and sometimes dangerous, containing methanol or other toxins that caused blindness or death. But desperate people took that risk because a few hours of drunken numbness was better than full consciousness of their circumstances. The monotony of Depression life contributed to mental decline. Every day was the same. Wake cold, stay hungry, worry constantly, go to bed cold. No vacations, no entertainment you couldn't afford, no variation or hope. The sameness was psychologically crushing. Humans need novelty, pleasure, and hope to maintain mental health. Depression-era Americans had none of these. Just an endless grey repetition of survival that ground down their spirits as effectively as it ground down their bodies. Some people found relief in religion, attending churches that offered community, warmth, and the promise that suffering had meaning. Others lost faith entirely, unable to reconcile a loving God with the magnitude of suffering they witnessed and experienced. Both responses were valid. Both reflected people trying to find meaning or escape in a world that seemed to have abandoned meaning entirely. The winters made everything worse. Seasonal affective disorder wasn't recognized yet, but it existed. The combination of physical cold, limited daylight, isolation, and intensified scarcity during winter months created perfect conditions for psychological collapse. Suicide rates peaked in winter. So did domestic violence, alcohol abuse, and mental health crises. Winter was when the depression within the depression became unbearable. What's haunting is how much of this suffering was invisible. People didn't talk about their mental health. They didn't seek help. They just endured, or they didn't, and either way, history barely recorded their psychological destruction. The Great Depression is remembered for economic statistics and political responses. But the real story, the human story, is millions of people mentally breaking under pressure that never should have been placed on them, suffering in silence because that's what their culture demanded. In the midst of all the suffering, something remarkable happened. People helped each other. Neighbours shared what little they had. Communities organised food drives, clothing swaps, and coal collections. Churches became shelters. Strangers invited strangers to warm themselves by their fires. It wasn't charity in the condescending sense. It was solidarity. Everyone was drowning, but they held on to each other anyway. In a time when institutions failed and the government was slow to act, ordinary people became each other's safety net. It wasn't enough to solve the crisis, but it was enough to keep hope flickering. The mutual aid that developed during the Depression wasn't organised from the top down. It emerged organically from neighbourhoods and communities where people recognised that collective survival required cooperation. When everyone was struggling, helping your neighbour wasn't altruism, it was enlightened self-interest. You might need help tomorrow, and the person you help today might be the one who saved your life next week. Neighbours shared food in ways that acknowledged dignity. You didn't knock on someone's door and say, "I know you're starving, here's some soup." You'd say, "I made way too much stew, would you mind taking some off my hands?" Or, "My chicken laid extra eggs this week, can you use a few?" These polite fictions allowed people to accept help without feeling like charity cases. Pride was one of the few things people still owned, and preserving it mattered. The practice of stone soup became literal. Families would contribute whatever ingredients they had to a communal pot. One family brought potatoes, another contributed an onion. Someone else had a bone with meat scraps. Individually, these ingredients were inadequate. Together they made a meal. The cooking often happened in someone's house, rotating among families so the burden of providing heat and space was shared. Everyone ate from the communal pot, and somehow there was always enough when resources were pooled. Clothing swaps became common events. Children outgrew clothes constantly, and families couldn't afford replacements. So communities organised exchanges where families brought outgrown or worn items and took what they needed. A coat that was too small for your son became the perfect size for your neighbour's daughter. Shoes with holes in the soles but intact uppers were combined with shoes that had good soles but torn uppers, creating Frankenstein footwear that was better than nothing. Women gathered to mend clothes collectively, their combined skills and supplies accomplishing what individuals couldn't manage alone. Churches became more than spiritual centres. They were warming stations, community centres, food distribution points, and shelters. Many churches kept their doors open during winter days, so people with no heat at home could sit in pews and warm themselves. Some churches organised basement churches, where families could sleep on floors when their homes became uninhabitable. Religious institutions, regardless of denomination, became physical manifestations of the principle that people should help each other survive. The barn-raising tradition, which had existed in rural America for generations, took on new urgency. When someone's barn collapsed under snow or burned down, neighbours would gather to rebuild it quickly. Nobody had money to pay for labour, so labour was freely given with the understanding that when your barn collapsed, and it probably would, others would help you. This mutual aid extended to house repairs, well digging and harvest help. Communities functioning on a gift economy where currency was labour and goodwill. Some neighbourhoods formed penny restaurants, where people could get a basic meal for almost nothing. These weren't commercial ventures trying to make profit. They were community efforts to feed people, run by volunteers using donated ingredients. The penny price preserved dignity. You were buying a meal, not accepting charity, while making food accessible to virtually everyone. The meals were simple, often just soup and bread, but they were hot, filling, and served with respect. Informal networks developed for sharing resources beyond food. Someone with a working washing machine might let neighbours use it. A family with a sewing machine would repair clothes for others. If you had a car that still ran, you gave rides to those who didn't. Skills became currency. The man who knew how to butcher would help process any meat someone acquired. The woman who was good with sick children would tend to neighbours' kids. A teacher might tutor children in exchange for eggs or vegetables. Barter systems emerged naturally, allowing people to trade what they had for what they needed. Children participated in community care networks. Older kids watched younger ones so parents could look for work or stand in relief lines. They ran errands for elderly neighbours who couldn't leave their homes in winter. They collected coal along railroad tracks and shared their finds with families who had young children or elderly members. Depression-era children learned early that community survival required everyone's contribution, regardless of age. Stories circulated about anonymous kindness. A family would wake to find a bag of coal on their doorstep with no note. A widow would discover her woodpile mysteriously replenished. Children would find their worn shoes replaced overnight with slightly better used shoes. These anonymous gifts were important because they allowed the giver to help without embarrassing the recipient, and they reinforced the sense that the community was looking out for everyone. The solidarity extended to protecting each other from outside threats. When banks foreclosed on farms, communities organised to intimidate buyers at auctions, ensuring properties sold for pennies and could be returned to original owners. When landlords tried to evict tenants, neighbours would physically block sheriffs from removing families. When utilities shut off someone's electricity or gas, neighbours would sometimes illegally reconnect services. These were acts of quiet rebellion against a system that had failed, with communities prioritising human welfare over property rights and profits. Not everyone participated. Some people hoarded resources and refused to help. Some landlords were merciless with evictions. Some employers exploited desperate workers. But these people became pariahs in their communities. Their stores were boycotted. Their names were spoken with contempt. Social pressure enforced a minimum standard of decency that laws and markets had abandoned. The bonds formed during Depression winters lasted lifetimes. People who'd helped each other survive remained close for decades afterward. The shared trauma and shared survival created connections deeper than ordinary friendships. These were people who'd seen you at your worst and helped anyway, who'd shared their last potato with you, who'd kept your children from freezing. Those bonds didn't break easily. Looking back, the community solidarity during the Depression stands out as one of humanity's better moments in an otherwise dark time. When everything else failed, the economy, the government, the weather, luck itself, people still had each other. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough to prevent suffering. But it was the difference between total catastrophe and survivable disaster. It proved that humans, even in the worst circumstances, are capable of remarkable kindness and cooperation. The Depression taught a generation that community wasn't optional, it was essential. And that lesson, passed down through families, influenced American culture for decades afterward. The generation that survived learned to help neighbours, to share resources, to pull together during crises. They remembered what had saved them when nothing else could, and they made sure their children understood. In the end, we only have each other. The Great Depression's winters were especially deadly for the elderly, disabled, and ill. They couldn't work. They couldn't forage. They relied on families who were already stretched beyond capacity. Many elderly people simply didn't survive. They died quietly in cold rooms, their deaths often unreported or attributed to natural causes. Nursing homes didn't exist for most. Assisted living was a fantasy. If your family couldn't care for you, you were on your own. Winter sorted the vulnerable from the survivors with brutal efficiency. In the 1930s, there was no social security until 1935, and even then benefits didn't start paying out until 1940. There was no Medicare, no Medicaid, no safety net for the elderly beyond whatever their families could provide. If you were old and poor, which described most elderly people during the Depression, you depended entirely on your children, relatives, or community charity. And when those resources were exhausted, you simply suffered and died, often alone. The elderly faced multiple compounding vulnerabilities. Their bodies couldn't regulate temperature as effectively, making them more susceptible to hypothermia. They needed more calories to maintain body heat, but often received less food as families prioritised feeding children and working adults. Their immune systems were weaker, making them vulnerable to pneumonia, influenza, and other diseases that thrived in cold, crowded conditions. They often had chronic conditions, arthritis, heart disease, diabetes, that went untreated because medical care was unaffordable. Many elderly people lived with their adult children, 3 generations crowding into small houses designed for one family. This created immediate conflicts over scarce resources. When there wasn't enough food, who went without? When there was only enough heat for one room, who got to stay there? When money had to be spent on shoes for the children or medicine for grandma, which took priority? These weren't abstract moral questions. They were daily decisions that haunted families. Some adult children cared for their elderly parents with heroic devotion, sacrificing their own needs to keep aging parents alive. They gave up their beds so parents could sleep closer to the stove. They fed parents from their own portions. They stayed home from job searches to tend to parents who couldn't be left alone. This devotion was real and widespread, but it was also exhausting and often insufficient. Love couldn't substitute for resources that didn't exist. Other families, stretched to breaking points, made brutal calculations. Elderly parents who couldn't contribute economically became burdens families literally couldn't afford. Some adult children, to their lasting shame and guilt, provided minimal care to aging parents, giving them less food, less warmth, less attention. It wasn't that they didn't love their parents. It was that they had to choose between keeping their own children alive and keeping their parents comfortable. When forced to choose, most chose their children. The guilt destroyed them, but they chose anyway. The poorhouse, that Victorian institution that was supposed to have disappeared, made a grim comeback during the Depression. These were county-run facilities where indigent elderly people were sent when they had nowhere else to go. Conditions were deliberately terrible. The idea was to discourage people from becoming dependent on public support. Residents lived in overcrowded dormitories, received minimal food, and were often required to work if physically able. In winter, poorhouses were freezing, disease-ridden places where people went to die slowly while being warehoused out of public sight. Disabled individuals faced similar abandonment. There were few accommodations for physical disabilities. If you couldn't walk, you needed someone to carry you, or you didn't go anywhere. If you were blind or deaf, employment was virtually impossible. If you had intellectual disabilities, you were often institutionalized in horrific asylums or kept hidden at home. During the Depression, when able-bodied people couldn't find work, disabled individuals had zero prospects. They depended entirely on family support that often wasn't available. The chronically ill were similarly vulnerable. Someone with tuberculosis needed rest, good nutrition, and ideally sanatorium care. They got none of these. Instead, they lived at home, infecting family members, slowly dying while trying not to be too much of a burden. Cancer patients suffered without pain medication. Diabetics died from lack of insulin, which existed but was expensive. People with heart conditions or kidney disease just deteriorated, knowing medical intervention existed somewhere but not for them. Mental illness was particularly stigmatized and untreated. Elderly people with dementia were labeled senile and often locked in rooms for their own safety. People with depression or anxiety were told to pull themselves together. Those with serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia were either institutionalized in nightmarish facilities or kept at home where families did their best but lacked any resources or knowledge to help. Winter isolation made mental health conditions worse, and deterioration was often rapid. Many elderly people, recognizing they'd become burdens, chose to die quietly. They'd stop eating, claiming they weren't hungry while secretly giving their food to grandchildren. They'd refuse medicine, saying it was too expensive and shouldn't be wasted on someone old. They'd develop pneumonia and decline treatment, accepting death as a relief to their struggling families. These weren't dramatic suicides. They were quiet surrenders. Elderly people choosing to die so others could live, sacrificing themselves without fanfare or acknowledgement. Some elderly people were simply abandoned. Adult children who couldn't care for parents would leave them at hospitals, poorhouses or churches, vanishing before anyone could stop them. Others were left in their own homes when families migrated west or moved to find work. They were given whatever food could be spared and a promise that someone would check on them, a promise that often went unfulfilled. Many elderly people died alone in cold houses, their bodies not discovered until spring or until someone finally remembered to check. Winter was particularly brutal because it accelerated all the vulnerabilities. An elderly person who might have survived summer on minimal food and care couldn't survive winter. The cold penetrated their thin bodies. Their weakened immune systems couldn't fight off infections. Falls on icy paths led to broken hips that couldn't be treated. Respiratory illnesses turned deadly within days. Winter functioned as a natural culling mechanism, removing the weakest members of society with efficient brutality. The deaths were often unreported or misreported. In rural areas, elderly people died and were buried quickly, sometimes without official documentation. Causes of death were listed vaguely. Old age, natural causes, heart failure. The actual cause, starvation, hypothermia, neglect, went unrecorded. This makes it impossible to know exactly how many elderly and vulnerable people died during Depression winters, but estimates suggest the numbers were significant, possibly adding tens of thousands of deaths beyond what would have occurred in normal economic times. The tragedy wasn't just that people died, it was that they died unnecessarily. These were preventable deaths. With adequate food, heat, and basic medical care, most of these elderly and vulnerable individuals could have survived. The resources existed in America. Food was being destroyed because it couldn't be sold profitably. Warehouses held coal, hospitals had empty beds. The problem wasn't scarcity, it was distribution, economics, and a system that valued property rights over human life. Families carried the guilt of these deaths for generations. Adult children who'd watched their parents die slowly, who'd made impossible choices about resource allocation, who'd been unable to provide adequate care despite desperate efforts, they never forgave themselves. The Depression didn't just kill the elderly and vulnerable, it traumatized their surviving families with guilt that lasted lifetimes. The vulnerable who didn't survive Depression winters left no monuments, no memorials, no historical records beyond occasional death certificates. They vanished quietly, their suffering unacknowledged, their deaths treated as inevitable rather than the systemic failures they actually were. They deserved better, they deserved to be remembered, and they deserved to have survived. Laundry during a Great Depression winter was an exercise in masochism. Water had to be hauled from a well or pump, heated on a stove you could barely afford to run, and used to scrub clothes by hand. In freezing temperatures, wet clothes hung on lines turned into frozen boards. Many people simply didn't wash clothes regularly. They couldn't spare the water, fuel, or energy. Body odour, grime, and lice became constant companions. Hygiene wasn't a priority when survival was on the line. Clean clothes were a luxury. Staying alive was the goal. Let's walk through the nightmare that was Depression-era laundry in winter. First, you needed water. If you had indoor plumbing, congratulations. You were in the minority, and even then, pipes often froze in winter, leaving you without running water anyway. Most people got water from outdoor wells or pumps, which meant walking outside in freezing temperatures, breaking through ice that had formed overnight, and hauling heavy buckets back to the house. A single load of laundry required multiple buckets, water for washing, water for rinsing, more water if you wanted to rinse twice, which you did because soap was precious and you didn't want to waste it by leaving residue in the fabric. Then you had to heat the water. This required lighting your stove or fireplace, which required fuel you probably couldn't afford to spare. Heating enough water for laundry might take hours and burn through a significant portion of your daily fuel allotment. You'd heat water in large pots or kettles, multiple batches, each one requiring time and fuel. The calculation was brutal. Spend resources on clean clothes or stay warm and fed. Most people chose warm and fed. Once you finally had hot water, the actual washing began. This was done in large tubs or basins, scrubbing clothes by hand against washboards, ridged metal or wood surfaces that worked through friction and elbow grease. Your knuckles would split and bleed from the cold water and repeated scraping. Your hands would turn red and raw. The lye soap, harsh and caustic, would burn any cuts or cracks in your skin. Washing clothes was painful, exhausting labour that could take hours for a single family's laundry. Then came wringing. You'd twist wet clothes to squeeze out as much water as possible, your hands cramping from the effort, your arms burning from repeatedly wringing heavy, waterlogged fabric. Some families had manual wringers, devices with rollers you'd crank to squeeze water out, but these were expensive tools many couldn't afford. Most people just twisted clothes until their hands couldn't grip anymore. Now the clothes needed to dry. In summer, this was straightforward. Hang them outside, let the sun do its work. In winter, it was a nightmare. Outdoor clotheslines were standard, and clothes hung outside in freezing temperatures would freeze solid within minutes. Your shirts and pants would become rigid boards, ice crystals forming in the fabric. They'd hang there for days, slowly freeze-drying, which technically worked but took forever. Some people brought frozen clothes inside to finish drying near the stove, creating a steamy, damp environment that wasted heat and encouraged mould. Indoor drying was problematic. Hanging wet clothes inside a small, poorly heated house meant everything stayed damp for days. The moisture had nowhere to go. It would condense on windows, walls, and bedding, creating humidity that made the cold feel worse and promoted mould growth. The house would smell like wet wool and mildew, a signature Depression-era perfume that everyone recognised and nobody enjoyed. Given the difficulty, most people just didn't wash clothes very often. Underwear, if you had any, might get washed every few weeks. Outer clothes went months between washings. Bedding was washed maybe twice a year, if that. People wore clothes until they were visibly dirty or smelled so bad that even Depression-era standards of tolerance were exceeded. Then they'd face the laundry ordeal, wash everything at once, and go back to not washing for as long as possible. The lack of regular washing had consequences. Body odour was universal. Everyone smelled. In crowded spaces like soup kitchens, bread lines, or shared tenements, the collective smell was overwhelming. But when everyone stinks, nobody's particularly bothered by it. Olfactory adaptation meant you stopped noticing after a while. It was only when you encountered someone who was clean that the contrast became obvious. Lice infestations were rampant. Body lice, head lice, pubic lice. These parasites thrived in unwashed clothes and bedding. They spread easily in crowded conditions and were nearly impossible to eliminate without hot water, soap, and frequent laundering. All things people couldn't afford. Families would spend evenings picking lice and nits from each other's hair, a bonding activity that also happened to be disgusting and futile since reinfestation was inevitable. Some people attempted spot cleaning, washing just the collar or armpits of a shirt instead of the whole garment. Others wore undergarments like long johns for weeks, reasoning that if the outer layer stayed relatively clean, the underlayer could be filthy. This logic was flawed but practical given the constraints. You couldn't wash everything, so you washed the visible parts and hoped for the best. The fabric of Depression-era clothes suffered from infrequent washing. Dirt and sweat broke down fibres, causing clothes to deteriorate faster, but washing them also caused wear, so families faced a lose-lose situation. Wash clothes and watch them fall apart from the scrubbing. Don't wash clothes and watch them rot from accumulated filth. Either way, the clothes didn't last, and replacements were impossible to afford. Women bore the brunt of laundry labour. It was considered women's work, added to the already overwhelming list of tasks women managed. They hauled water, heated it, scrubbed clothes, wrung them out, hung them, took them down, and did it all while also cooking, cleaning, caring for children, and trying to manage household budgets that couldn't balance. Laundry wasn't just physically exhausting. It was one more impossible expectation in a long list of impossible expectations. Children's clothes were particularly problematic. Kids got dirty quickly, wore through clothes fast, and needed regular changes as they grew. But during the Depression, children wore the same clothes day after day, sleeping in them, playing in them, going to school in them if school was still operating. Stains were permanent, holes were patched repeatedly, cleanliness was optional. The communal washhouse, common in some urban areas, offered an alternative. For a small fee, families could use shared washing facilities with proper tubs, wringers, and sometimes even heated water. But small fee was still too much for many families. Even a nickel for washing water was a nickel that could buy food. So most people stayed home and suffered through inadequate home laundering or skipped it entirely. Looking back, the laundry situation perfectly encapsulates Depression-era life. You had to choose between competing necessities, and there was never a good option. Clean clothes versus warm house. Hygiene versus survival. Spending resources on washing versus literally anything else. Every choice involved sacrifice, and every sacrifice had consequences. So people stopped washing their clothes regularly, accepted that everyone smelled, lived with lice as permanent residents, and added being clean to the long list of luxuries they'd once taken for granted and might never experience again. Clean clothes became a memory from better times, like full meals and warm houses and hope for the future. Things that used to exist but felt increasingly mythological as the Depression ground on, winter after frozen, filthy winter. When you have no money and it's too cold to go anywhere, what do you do for fun? The answer, whatever was free. Families gathered around radios if they had electricity, listening to shows like Amos and Andy or FDR's Fireside Chats. They played cards, told stories and sang songs. Libraries became sanctuaries, offering warmth and books. Some towns organised free dances or movie nights. Entertainment wasn't about luxury or escape. It was about staying sane, staying human, and reminding yourself that life was more than just suffering. Even if, most days, it really didn't feel that way. The radio was the Depression's greatest gift to people who had nothing else. If you could afford electricity or battery power, a radio connected you to a world beyond your frozen, hungry existence. Radio ownership actually increased during the Depression, which seems counterintuitive until you realise that entertainment was one of the few things that made life bearable. Families who couldn't afford food somehow found ways to keep their radios running because the alternative, sitting in silence with only your own despair for company, was worse than hunger. Radio programs during the 1930s weren't just entertainment, they were lifelines. Comedy shows like Amos and Andy, despite its problematic racial stereotypes, made people laugh when nothing else was funny. Adventure serials like The Lone Ranger provided escapism, transporting listeners to places where problems were solved in 30 minutes, and good guys always won. FDR's fireside chats, broadcast regularly, gave people hope that someone in power understood their struggles and was working on solutions. Whether FDR actually was solving things is debatable, but the feeling that someone cared mattered enormously to people who felt abandoned. Families scheduled their evenings around radio programs. Everyone would gather in whatever room had the radio, huddle close to conserve heat, and listen together. It was communal entertainment that required no money beyond the electricity or batteries to power the radio. Children would sit transfixed during adventure shows. Adults would forget their troubles during comedy hours. For brief moments, the Depression receded, replaced by stories of other people in other places dealing with different problems. It wasn't much, but it was something. Card games became evening entertainment. Poker, rummy, bridge. Games that required only a deck of cards and players. Cards were cheap, reusable, and provided hours of entertainment. Families played for matchsticks or buttons instead of money, keeping the competition real without the stakes. Some neighbourhoods organised card clubs where people rotated between houses, sharing whatever heat and snacks could be scraped together. The games weren't about winning. They were about social connection, about sitting in warm rooms with other people, about pretending life was normal enough to include recreation. Storytelling filled the hours when there was nothing else. Older family members would recount stories from their youth, tales that became more elaborate with each retelling. Fathers told stories they'd heard from their fathers. Mothers shared family histories. Children would listen, sometimes for the dozenth time, because hearing familiar stories was comforting. It connected them to a past when things had been better and implied a future when things might be better again. Oral history kept families together and time passing. Singing was free entertainment that required no equipment. Families sang hymns, folk songs, popular tunes remembered from better days. The singing wasn't always good, but it didn't need to be. It was about voices joining together, about creating something communal. Some families had instruments, a guitar, harmonica, or piano, and those homes became gathering places for neighbourhood sing-alongs. Music provided emotional release. You could sing sad songs that acknowledged the pain. You could sing hopeful songs that imagined better futures. Either way, you were expressing feelings that had nowhere else to go. Public libraries became sanctuaries during Depression winters. They offered heated buildings, free admission, and entire worlds contained in books. People who'd never been regular readers discovered libraries out of desperation for warm places to spend daytime hours. They'd sit reading magazines, newspapers, novels, anything to pass time in heated comfort. Libraries became de facto shelters, librarians often looking the other way when people obviously had nowhere else to go. Some people read books as escapism. Others read to learn skills that might lead to employment. Many just sat in warmth, pretending to read while actually resting their exhausted bodies and minds. Reading material was treasured. Families shared books among neighbours, creating informal lending libraries. Old magazines were read until they fell apart. Newspapers were read by multiple families passed from household to household. Children who'd learned to read in schools that were now closed would read aloud to families, providing entertainment and maintaining their own literacy. Comics became particularly popular because they offered visual storytelling that could be enjoyed even by those who struggled with reading. Some communities organised free events specifically to provide entertainment and relief. Churches hosted game nights, potluck dinners where everyone brought what little they could, and social gatherings in heated buildings. Towns with community centres offered free dances where people could socialise, move their bodies, and pretend for a few hours that life included joy. These events were well attended because they combined multiple needs: warmth, socialization, entertainment, and the psychological necessity of doing something other than surviving. Movies, despite costing money, remained surprisingly popular. Admission might be 10 or 15 cents, an outrageous luxury for most families, but movie theatres offered heated buildings and 2 hours of complete escapism. The films of the 1930s were often deliberately cheerful, musicals, comedies, adventure stories, providing relief from depression reality. Some theatres offered dish nights, where attendees received free plates or cups, making movie-going slightly more justifiable as a practical expense. Others had bank nights with prize drawings that gave people a tiny chance of winning money. Families would save for weeks to afford a single movie outing, treating it as a special occasion that broke the monotony of depression existence. Children created their own entertainment with no resources. They played outside when weather permitted, inventing games that required no equipment. Tag, hide and seek, kick the can. They drew pictures in the dirt. They built snow forts and had snowball fights, turning frozen misery into play. They told each other stories, acted out scenarios, and created imaginary worlds where children had enough to eat and houses were warm. Play was resilience in miniature, children refusing to let circumstances destroy their capacity for joy. Board games, puzzles, and other indoor activities were used until they literally fell apart. A single jigsaw puzzle would be assembled, disassembled, and reassembled dozens of times. Board games were played so frequently that pieces wore out and had to be replaced with hand-carved substitutes. These weren't just games, they were investments in mental health, ways to keep minds active when everything else in life felt stagnant. The entertainment people found during Depression winters wasn't glamorous or exciting by modern standards. It was quiet, often desperate attempts to maintain humanity in dehumanizing circumstances. Sitting around a radio, playing cards, reading library books, singing together. These were small rebellions against a reality that wanted to crush all joy. They didn't solve problems or fill stomachs or warm frozen houses, but they reminded people that they were still human, still capable of laughter and stories and momentary happiness, and sometimes, on the coldest, hungriest nights, that reminder was the only thing that kept people going. You'd think spring would bring relief, but during the Great Depression, it just brought different problems. The snow melted, revealing dead livestock, ruined crops, and houses that had barely survived the winter. Floods swept through towns where frozen ground couldn't absorb the runoff. The economy didn't magically recover, jobs didn't reappear, hunger didn't end. Spring just meant you could be miserable in slightly warmer weather. People patched their homes, planted gardens, and tried to prepare for the next winter, knowing it would be just as brutal and they'd have even less to face it with. The thaw was psychologically devastating. All winter, snow had covered the landscape, hiding the full extent of decay and destruction. When it melted, reality emerged like a cruel reveal. Dead cattle and horses that had frozen in fields appeared as the snow retreated, their bloated corpses stinking up the warming air. Barns that had collapsed under snow weight became visible again, piles of broken wood and twisted metal. Fences that had been burned for fuel left gaps that would need replacing. Every melting snowbank exposed another piece of destruction. Floods were common because months of frozen ground couldn't absorb the sudden influx of meltwater and spring rain. Rivers that had been frozen solid became raging torrents, overflowing banks and sweeping through towns. The same communities that had been frozen and buried in January were now underwater in April. Homes flooded. What little food had been stored was destroyed. Roads became impassable muddy tracks. The floods weren't just inconvenient. They were catastrophic for communities already hanging on by threads. Spring planting season arrived, and with it, the crushing realization that most people had nothing to plant. Seeds cost money. If you'd eaten your seed corn during the winter to avoid starvation, and many people had, you had nothing for spring crops. Some families borrowed seeds from neighbours who'd somehow preserved theirs, promising to repay from harvest. But everyone knew that promise was shaky. If the crops failed again, as they had for years, there'd be no harvest to share. The gardens people planted were desperate, often futile efforts. The soil was depleted from years of drought and dust. Even with spring rain, nothing grew properly. Seeds would sprout, then wither. Plants that managed to grow produced small, inadequate yields. Farmers and home gardeners worked themselves to exhaustion tilling, planting, weeding, watering, hoping this year would be different. It usually wasn't. The gardens failed, and with them, the hope that self-sufficiency might be possible. House repairs became urgent as winter damage became visible. Roofs had leaked and now needed patching. Windows broken by ice needed replacing. Foundations damaged by frost heaves needed attention. But repairs required materials and money that nobody had. People improvised with scrap wood, tar paper, and whatever could be salvaged from abandoned buildings. Houses got uglier. Patchwork structures that looked like architectural quilts. As long as they stood for another winter, that's all that mattered. The promise of warmth meant people needed less fuel, which should have been relief. But it also meant losing the one place where neighbours naturally gathered, around fires. Winter had forced community through shared survival. Spring dispersed people back to isolated struggles. The social cohesion that had kept people emotionally afloat dissolved as temperatures rose. Isolation returned, and with it, the individual despair that communal suffering had temporarily masked. Employment didn't improve with spring. The seasonal construction work that normally picked up with good weather remained non-existent. Factories didn't suddenly reopen. Farms had no money to hire workers. The job market that had been frozen solid in winter remained just as barren in spring, just less literally frozen. Men who'd hoped spring would bring work opportunities found the same unemployment, just now, without the excuse that it was too cold to work. The psychological impact of continued joblessness in warm weather was somehow worse. Winter had been an explanation for failure. Spring offered no such comfort. Food remained scarce. Spring was traditionally the hungry time, even in good years. Winter stores depleted, new crops not yet ready. During the Depression, this period was especially brutal. The vegetables and fruits that would come in summer were still months away. Wild edibles like dandelion greens and mushrooms helped slightly, but not enough. Starvation didn't end in spring. It just continued under blue skies instead of grey ones, which somehow made it feel more surreal. The psychological toll of spring was unique. Winter's misery had a certain logic. Of course, life is hard when it's freezing, but spring traditionally symbolized renewal, hope, new beginnings. When spring arrived and nothing actually renewed, when hope didn't materialize, when beginnings were just continuations of the same suffering, it broke something in people's spirits. The disconnect between what spring was supposed to mean and what it actually delivered created a special type of despair. Children who'd survived winter emerged pale, thin, and often sick. The illnesses they'd contracted in crowded, cold conditions didn't disappear with warm weather. Respiratory infections lingered. Malnutrition's effects became more visible in sunlight. Swollen bellies, thin limbs, dull eyes. Parents saw their children in full daylight for the first time in months and were horrified by how much they'd deteriorated. Spring didn't bring health. It just illuminated sickness that winter darkness had hidden. Families began preparing for the next winter immediately because they knew it was coming and it would be terrible. They tried to stockpile firewood by gathering deadfall from forests. They attempted to preserve any food they could grow or forage. They patched holes in clothing and walls. They made plans for survival that felt increasingly futile because each year they started from a weaker position with fewer resources. The hamster wheel of depression life became clear in spring. You worked desperately just to prepare to survive the next disaster, with no energy left for actually improving your situation. The farmers who remained on their land planted again, knowing the odds were against them. The Dust Bowl conditions hadn't improved. The drought continued. The soil was still ruined. But what else could they do? Farming was their identity, their livelihood, their land. So they planted with bitter hope, expecting failure but unable to stop trying. When crops predictably failed again, the defeat was crushing but somehow also expected. Spring had promised nothing and delivered exactly that. Migrations westward increased in spring as travel became possible. Families who'd barely survived winter decided they couldn't face another one. They loaded trucks with whatever they could carry, and joined the streams of refugees heading toward California, toward rumoured jobs and kinder climates. They left behind homes, land, communities, lives they'd built over generations. Spring made leaving physically possible, and desperation made it psychologically necessary. For those who stayed, spring was just the prelude to summer heat, dust storms, and then another winter. It was a brief intermission in ongoing suffering, a temporary respite that didn't actually rest anyone. The cycle was relentless: survive winter, endure spring, suffer through summer, dread fall, face winter again. Each cycle left people weaker, poorer, more broken. Spring didn't break that cycle. It just rotated it forward another notch. The cruel truth was that spring during the Depression didn't bring hope. It brought visibility to how much had been lost, clarity about how little had improved, and the certainty that everything would get worse again soon. People greeted spring not with joy, but with grim determination to survive what came next. And what came next was always worse than what had come before. The people who survived the Great Depression's winters never forgot them. They became a generation defined by frugality, resilience, and a bone-deep understanding of how quickly everything could fall apart. They saved everything: string, buttons, jars, foil. They wasted nothing. They valued stability over risk, security over luxury. They taught their children to appreciate what they had because they remembered what it felt like to have nothing. The trauma of those winters shaped families for decades, creating a legacy of caution, preparedness, and gratitude that lasted long after the economy recovered. The Depression generation became legendary hoarders, though that word doesn't capture the rationality behind their behaviour. They saved everything because they'd learned that anything could become useful, valuable, or necessary. String was tied into balls and stored in drawers. Buttons were cut from worn-out clothes before the fabric became rags. Glass jars were washed, saved, and reused for decades. Aluminum foil was carefully smoothed, folded, and reused until it fell apart. These weren't compulsive behaviours. They were survival strategies that had proven essential, habits formed when waste literally meant death. Food waste became morally unacceptable to Depression survivors. They ate leftovers until leftovers had leftovers. They scraped plates clean, saved every scrap for soup stock, and reacted with genuine distress if they saw food thrown away. Taking a single bite of something and discarding it wasn't just wasteful. It was offensive, almost sacrilegious. They'd starved. They'd watched children go hungry. They'd rationed single potatoes across entire families. So when their children or grandchildren later threw away half a sandwich, the reaction was disproportionate and incomprehensible to younger generations who'd never known hunger. But to Depression survivors, wasted food was wasted life. Their relationship with money was transformed permanently. They didn't trust banks, even after deposit insurance made banking safer. They hid cash in mattresses, in walls, in coffee cans buried in backyards. They paid cash for everything when possible, avoiding debt with pathological fear. Credit cards, when they emerged in the 1950s, were viewed with deep suspicion. The idea of borrowing money for anything beyond absolute necessities was terrifying, because they remembered how quickly debt could destroy you when income disappeared. Employment security became the paramount career consideration. Depression survivors took stable government jobs, union jobs, any position with pensions and benefits. They worked for the same employer for 40 years because changing jobs meant risk, and risk was intolerable. They advised their children to pursue safe careers, teaching, civil service, nursing, rather than risky entrepreneurship or creative pursuits. The message was clear: security first, fulfillment, maybe never. Dreams were luxuries you couldn't afford when survival was uncertain. The generation became obsessively prepared for disaster. They kept pantries stocked with months of food. They maintained vegetable gardens long after they needed them for sustenance, because gardens represented self-sufficiency. They owned multiple coats, blankets, and sets of warm clothing because they remembered being cold. They couldn't relax into abundance even when it arrived because somewhere deep in their minds they were still waiting for the next collapse, the next winter, the next disaster that would take everything again. Their parenting style reflected Depression trauma. They insisted children clean their plates, finish every bite, and never complain about food. They taught children to save money, to avoid debt, to value practicality over pleasure. They were sometimes harsh about wasted resources or what they perceived as entitled behaviour. When their baby boomer children grew up in post-war prosperity and couldn't understand the obsessive frugality, conflict erupted. The children saw neurotic penny pinching. The parents saw essential life skills being rejected by kids who didn't understand how quickly comfort could vanish. Depression survivors had complicated relationships with material possessions. They accumulated things but struggled to enjoy them. New clothes stayed in closets unworn because they were too good for daily use. Furniture was covered in plastic. Good dishes stayed in cabinets for special occasions that never seemed special enough. They owned things but couldn't actually use them, perpetually saving them for futures that felt uncertain despite decades of stability. The scarcity mindset never left. They developed an almost spiritual appreciation for small comforts, a warm house, a full pantry, clean water. These weren't taken for granted. They were miracles acknowledged daily, sometimes explicitly. Depression survivors would comment on having enough to eat, on houses being warm, on children being healthy, not as casual observations but as profound gratitudes. Their grandchildren found this strange, even morbid. But for survivors, every comfortable moment existed in contrast to remembered suffering. The generation's work ethic became legendary, but was rooted in trauma, not virtue. They worked constantly, compulsively, driven by fear that stopping meant disaster. Retirement was psychologically difficult because it meant not working, and not working felt dangerous. They couldn't relax because relaxation had once been a luxury they couldn't afford, and the fear that it still was never fully disappeared. The hustle wasn't about success. It was about staying ahead of the poverty that haunted their memories. Their marriages were pragmatic rather than romantic. Depression survivors had often married for survival, combining resources, sharing burdens, facing disasters together. Love was present but expressed through practical care rather than emotional expression. Husbands provided, wives managed. Emotions were controlled because falling apart was dangerous when circumstances were precarious. This created functional but often emotionally distant marriages that their children later rejected in favour of more expressive relationships. They passed trauma to their children in ways nobody understood at the time. The anxiety about money, the inability to throw anything away, the fear of change, the obsessive preparation for disasters that never came. Children absorbed these patterns without understanding their origins, inheriting neuroses that made sense in depression context, but seemed irrational in prosperity. Intergenerational trauma wasn't recognised yet, but it was definitely transmitted. Yet they also passed down resilience, competence, and genuine gratitude. Depression survivors knew how to do things: grow food, repair clothes, fix machinery, make do with limited resources. They taught practical skills that later generations lost. They modelled resilience that showed their children and grandchildren what humans could endure. They demonstrated that catastrophe, while devastating, wasn't necessarily permanent. You could survive. You could rebuild. You could continue. The Depression generation rarely talked about their experiences in detail. The trauma was too deep, too painful, too all-encompassing. They'd mention it occasionally, references to during the Depression or when things were bad, but they didn't dwell. They'd survived by moving forward, not by processing emotions, and they continued that pattern. This silence meant their children and grandchildren often didn't fully understand what they'd endured or why they behaved the way they did. But the lessons persisted, transmitted through behaviour rather than words. The full pantries, the saved string, the worn but functional clothes, the fear of waste, the value placed on stability. These were all messages from people who'd learned truths about human vulnerability and resilience that they couldn't fully articulate but couldn't forget. The Great Depression's winters had frozen more than just landscapes. They'd frozen certain truths into a generation's bones, that security is fragile, that comfort is temporary, that disaster lurks closer than anyone wants to admit, and that survival requires preparation, frugality, and community. These lessons served them well through subsequent challenges: World War II, Cold War fears, economic ups and downs. They'd already survived the worst. Everything else was manageable in comparison. And when they finally died, in the 1980s, 90s and 2000s, they left behind children and grandchildren who'd grown up prosperous, who'd never known real hunger or cold, who couldn't fully understand the obsessive behaviours and anxious preparations. But they also left a legacy. Proof that humans can endure unimaginable hardship and emerge not broken, but tempered into something stronger, more careful, and deeply, eternally grateful for every warm, fed, safe moment that follows. The winters of the Great Depression revealed something fundamental about human nature. People are stronger and kinder than they think, but they shouldn't have to prove it by freezing in cardboard shacks. The 1930s showed us that economic systems can fail catastrophically, that suffering is not equally distributed, and that survival often depends on luck as much as effort. But it also showed us that communities can endure, that strangers can become saviours, and that even in the coldest, darkest times, people find ways to hold on to hope, humanity, and each other. Those winters were brutal, but the people who lived through them were more brutal still, in the best possible way. The Depression taught us that civilization is thinner than we want to believe. The distance between prosperity and desperation turned out to be about 3 missed paychecks and 1 bad winter. People who'd been solidly middle class in 1929 were living in Hoovervilles by 1932. The safety net everyone assumed existed turned out to be largely imaginary. When the economy collapsed, millions discovered simultaneously that they were far more vulnerable than they'd realised, that the stability they counted on was always conditional, and that the systems supposedly protecting them were actually quite fragile. But we also learned about human adaptability. People who'd never imagined living without heat figured out how to survive sub-zero temperatures with newspaper insulation and shared body warmth. Families who'd never grown food learned to garden, forage, and stretch inadequate resources across impossible time spans. Children who'd been sheltered became competent scavengers and caretakers. Humans are extraordinarily adaptable when forced to be, capable of surviving conditions that would seem unsurvivable from the comfort of normalcy. We're more resilient than we think, which is both reassuring and terrifying because it means we can endure far more suffering than we should ever have to. The Depression revealed that individual character matters less than we'd like to believe. Good people starved, bad people prospered, hard work didn't guarantee success, laziness didn't guarantee failure. The Protestant work ethic that had supposedly built America turned out to be inadequate when the economic system itself collapsed. Farmers who'd worked themselves to exhaustion lost everything. Bankers who'd made reckless decisions lived comfortably. The lesson was uncomfortable. Effort and virtue don't protect you when systemic forces beyond your control decide to crush you. Morality and hard work matter, but they're not magic shields against economic catastrophe. Yet we also saw that community and solidarity were the only things that consistently worked. When institutions failed, when government was too slow, when markets didn't self-correct, ordinary people helping each other was what kept society from completely disintegrating. The soup kitchens, the shared resources, the neighbours checking on neighbours. This grassroots mutual aid prevented catastrophe from becoming apocalypse. Humans are social creatures who instinctively cooperate during crises, and that instinct saved countless lives during the Depression. It's a lesson worth remembering. When systems fail, community is what remains. The Depression demonstrated that suffering isn't equally distributed and never has been. The wealthy experienced inconvenience. The poor experienced death. People with resources weathered the storm. People without resources drowned. The myth of shared sacrifice was always a lie. The banker who lost his vacation home was not suffering equivalently to the farmer who lost his children to starvation. Economic collapse doesn't affect everyone equally, and pretending it does only obscures the real dynamics of power, privilege, and vulnerability. Some people had cushions, others were already on the floor when the collapse began. But those winters also revealed extraordinary compassion. People with almost nothing shared with people who had absolutely nothing. Strangers took in families they'd never met. Communities organised to protect their most vulnerable members. Yes, there was also cruelty, hoarding, and exploitation. Humans are complex, but the overwhelming pattern was mutual aid, generosity born not from abundance but from shared suffering. When everyone is drowning, you grab the person next to you not because you're a hero, but because it's what humans do. That instinct toward cooperation, toward collective survival, is one of our species' most valuable traits. The Depression taught us that hope is irrational and essential. Rationally, many people during the 1930s should have given up. The odds were against them. The situation kept deteriorating. Relief seemed impossible, yet most people kept going. They planted gardens that would probably fail. They looked for jobs that didn't exist. They told their children things would get better, while having no evidence that they would. This wasn't stupidity. It was the human capacity for hope against reason, for continuing even when continuation seems pointless. That trait is why humans survive impossible situations. We're too stubborn to quit, too imaginative to stop hoping, too connected to each other to give up while others are still fighting. We learned that government and economic systems are human creations, not natural laws. The Depression happened because of choices, policy decisions, market structures, distribution systems that humans had created and could theoretically change. The suffering wasn't inevitable or natural. It was the result of systems that prioritize certain values, property rights, market freedom, creditor protection, over others, human welfare, food security, shelter. This realization was radical then, and remains important now. Economic suffering is usually a policy choice, not an unavoidable fate. The Depression's winters also taught us that trauma echoes across generations. The children who survived those years passed their anxieties, their frugality, their fears to their children and grandchildren. Trauma doesn't end when circumstances improve. It persists, shapes behavior, influences choices decades later. Understanding this helps explain why the Depression generation behaved as they did, and reminds us that today's crises will create ripples we can't yet see, affecting people who haven't been born yet. Perhaps most importantly, those brutal winters taught us that human dignity matters more than survival efficiency. Yes, people survived in Hoovervilles and soup lines, but they survived diminished, traumatized, scarred. Survival isn't enough. People need dignity, agency, security, hope. A society that forces its members to choose between dignity and survival has failed, regardless of how many technically survive. The Depression showed us that keeping people alive isn't sufficient if you're destroying their humanity in the process. Finally, those winters taught us that we forget too easily. The Depression generation remembered, but their children grew comfortable, and their grandchildren assumed prosperity was normal and permanent. Every generation seems to need to relearn that economic security is fragile, that crises can emerge quickly, that the unprepared suffer most. We're living through this lesson again now, as income inequality grows, climate change accelerates, and new crises loom. The question is whether we'll learn the Depression's lessons about safety nets, mutual aid, system fragility, and shared vulnerability before we're forced to relive them. The winters of the Great Depression were laboratories of human behavior under extreme stress. What they revealed was complex. Humans are both stronger and more fragile than we believe, both more selfish and more generous, both more adaptable and more traumatized by hardship. We can survive almost anything, but survival costs more than we want to pay. We can help each other through impossible situations, but we need systems and structures to make that help effective and dignified. Those frozen, hungry, desperate years left us with knowledge purchased at terrible cost. Know that we're vulnerable, that we need each other, that systems must serve human welfare, and that winter, literal and metaphorical, always returns. The only question is whether we'll be prepared. So you've made it through a single winter in the Great Depression. Congratulations! You survived frozen houses, starvation meals, and the constant terror of not knowing if spring would ever come. You've experienced unemployment that destroyed identities, blizzards that buried entire towns, and the soul-crushing reality of watching your children go hungry while being completely powerless to help them. The people who lived through those winters weren't heroes in the Hollywood sense. They didn't choose their suffering or overcome it through some inspiring montage of determination. They just endured. Day after freezing day, winter after brutal winter, they got up, faced impossible circumstances, and kept going because the alternative was dying, and most people aren't quite ready for that. What's remarkable isn't that they survived, though that is remarkable. It's that they survived while maintaining their humanity. They shared what little they had. They helped neighbours who couldn't help themselves. They found moments of laughter and music and hope in circumstances designed to destroy all three. They proved that humans, even when pushed to the absolute edge, are capable of extraordinary resilience and unexpected kindness. But let's be clear, they shouldn't have had to. The Great Depression wasn't a natural disaster. It was a systemic failure that could have been prevented, managed better, and ended sooner. Those winters taught us important lessons about vulnerability, community, and the fragility of the systems we build. The question is whether we're paying attention. So tonight, as you drift off in your heated home, with food in your refrigerator and a job you'll return to tomorrow, maybe take a moment to appreciate what you have, not with guilt, but with gratitude. Because somewhere in the 1930s, your great-grandparents survived hell so you wouldn't have to, and they'd be glad you don't have to. That was always the point. Sleep well.